Deep beneath the modern temple of Seti I in Abydos lies another world, a submerged hall of stone that no one can quite explain. It's called the Osireion, a megalithic chamber built from blocks of granite so massive they rival those of Giza. Archaeologists say it was built to look ancient, but the stones tell a different story. They're weathered by water, not by floods or rain, but by centuries of standing water. That means this place was built when Egypt was still green, before the Sahara became desert. Now, if this idea proves to be true, then the Osireion could be thousands of years older than the pharaohs above it, older than the dynasties, older than recorded history itself. The carvings in the newer temple speak of gods who came from the stars, but the structure below, it feels more like something left behind, a remnant from another age that didn't survive the last great flood. If this single temple is older than Egypt, then what about Giza? What about the pyramids themselves? Could they too be relics of a civilization that lived before the Younger Dryas, before the world froze and began again? But first, before we descend into the unknown voids throughout Egypt, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. And now, let's return to the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid, to a place where the mystery truly begins. A palm-sized rover noses into a limestone throat, its treads whispering against dust that hasn't moved in centuries. The shaft is barely wider than your shoulders. The air feels stale through the monitor, a pale ribbon of light pushing forward as if sound itself were holding its breath. On the screen, the walls stay true. The tunnel doesn't wander. It runs as though drawn by a careful hand toward a point no one in the passage can see. There are 4 of these conduits in Khufu's pyramid, 2 rising from the king's chamber and 2 from the queen's. They snake upward at tight angles, not wide enough for people, not shaped for airflow. Some call them vents, but they end in blockages, little stone doors with copper handles and sometimes another gap beyond. Others call them star paths. The story says they look at specific lights in the sky during a window in time when those lights held ritual power. Orion's belt, Sirius, Alpha Draconis, the old pole star that held the ceiling while the world turned. You watch the feed as the rover noses up to a limestone slab with 2 nubs of corroded metal. The camera tilts, measuring angle against gravity. The readout stutters and then holds. The line is steep, steady, not random. If the builders aimed, what were they aiming at? And when would those targets have sat on that line? A date hangs in the air like a number written in chalk on slate, waiting for a hand to step in and circle it. Inside a dim office near the plateau, a sky mapper leans over a tablet and pulls the heavens back in time. Not in days or months, but in the slow drift called precession, the long wobble of Earth's axis that moves star positions over millennia. He keys in the shaft inclinations and azimuths, setting one line for the southern channel from the king's chamber and one for the north. He layers the southern channel from the queen's, then the north. The mesh of lines looks like a crossing of threads. Then he winds the sky back toward a range when belt stars crouched lower, when Sirius rose earlier, when Alpha Draconis hugged the celestial pole like a nail in the roof. That's the claim that gave the story teeth. Some whisper that the Great Pyramid is a frozen diagram of the sky at a specific epoch before dynastic Egypt. The pattern points most strongly toward a date band in the 3rd millennium BCE for practical orientation, and another band in deep antiquity if you favour mythic echoes. The Orion correlation idea lives here, in the target list and the geometry. It proposes the southern shafts aim toward Orion's belt and Sirius, while the northern ones point near Alpha Draconis and perhaps Kochab, stars that help fix north when true north shifts over long cycles. Critics counter that patterns emerge easily when you are free to change dates until lines meet, and that a broad sweep of years can produce at least a loose match, if you accept a wide enough bullseye. Measurements give the debate a flaw. Surveyors have logged the southern King's Chamber shaft to near 45 degrees and a fraction, the northern near 32. The Queen's Chamber shafts run lower, in the 30s and 20s. Those numbers vary slightly between teams because stone has shifted and segments bend, but the general profile holds: narrow, accurate, and inclined enough to cross the pyramid's thickness and still climb. Those angles exist whether you believe in star targets or not. They aren't vague guesses, they're inclinations you can read with a level and a clinometer in a tight corridor baked into rock. Robotic explorers added more texture to the map. One small crawler reached a door with copper fittings, drilled a neat hole, slid a snake camera through, and found another door behind it, like a nested set of locks. In another shaft, a cavity appeared beyond a similar slab, not large, but empty enough to suggest the channel goes further than a dead end. In the northern Queen's Chamber channel, engineers steered a probe through twists no person could pass and saw tool marks in stone that looked new, only because no air touched them for 4,000 years. The robots do not argue, they note distances, angles, and stops. They show that the builders were comfortable placing hardware in places no human would ever visit again. Back in the office, the sky mapper drags a slider. He sets a date when Alpha Draconis sits near the pole and tests the northern shafts. The line is not exact, but it is close enough to keep the discussion alive. He moves to the south and checks the belt stars. These rise and set with a slight slope, and the shaft isn't a telescope tube. It is a narrow channel at a fixed angle, so he adjusts epoch until the angle of a star's transit crosses that fixed line within the shaft's tolerance. There are windows where that happens. There are also windows where it doesn't. If you allow a few degrees of leeway to account for stone flex and construction variance, the matches widen. Tighten the tolerance and the date band narrows, and sometimes slips beyond what conventional timelines would prefer. The Orion mapping idea extends onto the ground as well, linking the three main pyramids to the three belt stars by layout and relative size. Skeptics reply that the desert offers space to draw many shapes, and that other constellations could be matched with enough leniency. They also note that other Old Kingdom sites show strong north-south orientation habits that align with practical surveying using circumpolar stars, not one specific stellar picture. The ritual meaning, if there is one, rides on texts placed centuries after the stones, and on the way the culture spoke of the sky as the road of the dead. The hardest part of the claim sits there, not in the numbers but in the intent. Did they draw a map on the ground, or did they simply aim for cosmic north and the sacred starfields as a sign of order? A field engineer scrolls through a report. He runs a finger along a line that marks the angle measured from the King's Chamber to the southern shaft, roughly 45 degrees upslope, steady over its accessible length. Another sheet shows the northern channel near 32 degrees, with a bend where it dodges structural stones. He notes that the bends complicate simple sighting. A beam wouldn't pass cleanly end to end. If star targeting occurred, it would have been about an angle set to meet a star's path at a point, not a clear view to open sky. That limits the narrative to symbolic connection or to construction with ephemeral sightlines during building, removed later by plugs. It doesn't kill the idea, it just makes it more subtle. Those little copper handles on the doors have their own pull. Metal is rare in these contexts. Copper ages in a particular way, greenish and frail. Why put fittings on doors in shafts no one could access after sealing? Supporters suggest these were ritual closures for pathways, meaningful even if unseen. Others dismiss the fittings as simple installation aids left in place, like bracket points for lowering and locking. A robotic probe's camera doesn't settle that question. It only shows you two bright circles on a pale square and the brushstrokes of a tool on the limestone face. When you draw a line between what we know and what we think, the line falls like this. We know the shaft angles within a fraction of a degree over accessible segments. We know there are doors and sometimes voids beyond them. We know the angles could intersect star paths during certain epochs, if you accept a range of tolerance. We also know the channels bend, disallowing a straight shot for sighting. Interpretation picks up everything after that. Target lists, myths, meanings. These are guesses held up against a sky chart and a set of numbers etched into a pyramid's bones. A conservator kneels in the Queen's chamber and presses a hand against the entrance of one of its channels. The stone is cold, even in summer heat. Her flashlight grazes the cut edges. The opening is too small for a child and too purposeful to be random. She makes a note about soot, or the lack of it, and the way dust piles against the lip. No breeze, no through flow. Whatever these were, they weren't for air in the usual sense. That supports the idea of ceremony, or it supports the idea of precision construction features that became sealed features of a larger build. The room does not say which. In the outer night, stars wheel slow. Orion's belt dips in winter. Sirius flares bright in the south. Alpha Draconis no longer holds the pole. Time moved the yardsticks, yet these shafts keep their tilt. If the lines once met sky and meaning, the meeting happened in a window that closed. If they never met, and we are pattern hunting in the dark, the numbers still sing a careful song. Angles, repeatable and tight. Blocks fitted with channels that rise, bend and stop behind small doors like notes tied off at the end of a bar. Even the critics grant the measurements. You can disagree with the narrative, but not with an angle you can verify. That is the hinge of this scene. Precision both underfoot and overhead. A ground plan that snaps to true north within minutes of arc. Internal paths that hold a set slope almost as if they were extensions of a surveyor's eye. You sense a convergence without a verdict. The pyramid acts like a machine that once spoke to the sky, or a machine that only speaks to stone. Both readings leave the same taste. Someone kept a close watch on direction. A technician powers down the rover. The small screen fades, and the room seems wider for a beat. You could end the story here, in measured inclines and debated star goals, but the pyramid has more to say in spaces you can't crawl. High above the Grand Gallery, Muon detectors have traced shapes that are not rock. Bright patches on a slate of density where there should be none. Those patches raise their own careful questions about purpose and plan, and whether design lives not just in lines aimed outward, but in volumes hidden inside. The camera arm folds, the hum drops. The next image will come from particles falling from space, reading the mountain like rain. The detector is a metal box the size of a suitcase, hardly grand enough for the work it does. It sits on a low platform in a service corridor where the air is cool and dry, dust folded into the corners like old paper. Above it, tons of limestone pressed down. Through that thickness, particles from space pass like ghosts with schedules, crossing stone and air without asking. Each muon leaves a faint mark. One by one, they trace a slow photograph where brightness means emptiness, and darkness means rock that refuses to yield. A technician kneels next to the rig with a notebook resting on one knee. His pencil ticks like a small metronome as he notes the time. He doesn't speak because sound carries strangely here, bouncing off the rough walls in shallow echoes. He glances at a handheld screen connected by cable to the box. The display updates in patience, grain by grain. A rectangle forms where there should be none, brighter than the limestone around it, like a window lit from behind. He taps the edge of the screen with the eraser, not to rush it, but to feel present in the room as the image thickens. Scan pyramids learn to listen to the pyramid this way, with instruments that do not drill or pry. Instead, they wait. By placing detectors in known chambers and corridors, they measured how many particles arrive after crossing the structure from different angles. Areas with less stone yield more particles. Areas with more stone dim the stream. Over months, that difference maps into geometry. Their maps revealed an anomaly above the Grand Gallery, an elongated space not on any historic plan, as if someone had removed a slice of the pyramid and then sealed it again. It sits high, roughly along the gallery's axis, long like a corridor and tall enough to register as more than a crack. When that finding first surfaced, the words were careful. An anomaly. A void. No one said chamber. No one said archive. Those words were left to the margins of late-night shows and private emails. The team spoke of mass distribution and potential stress relief zones, spaces that reduce weight over critical passages below. It's a conservative read and a sensible one. The Great Pyramid is a stack of stone engineered to hold its own gravity, and ancient builders use staggered layers and hidden spaces to manage that load. Yet the new void's size pulls the mind. If structural, it is large. If intentional, it is larger in meaning. Access is tight. The interior permissions are strict, as they should be when a monument has survived for so long. So endoscopes go where they can, feeling their way through narrow passages that kink without warning. In some shafts, tiny cameras have met doors, thin limestone slabs with copper fittings that look like handles without handles, doors without rooms. The lens tries to peer through the seams. Dust drifts past the LED light like slow snow. Then the pathway narrows and the scope stops, coiled wire paying out with no more slack. Behind that small gate, whatever space lies beyond remains just beyond. In a monitoring tent near the site, an engineer leans over a larger display that aggregates months of muon counts. The image is coarse, like a weather radar from the early days of flight, yet the shapes keep consistent across algorithms. He circles a bright streak with a felt-tip pen and writes down a date. A colleague clears her throat and points to a second, fainter patch that appears when the detector shifts position. Cross-checking two positions helps cancel noise. The faint patch holds. She doesn't smile. The work does not celebrate early. It asks for more exposure time, for confirmatory runs, and for patience measured not in days but in seasons. Mography sounds arcane, but the idea is simple. Cosmic rays strike Earth's upper atmosphere and create a cascade of short-lived particles. Among them are muons, charged and heavy, racing through matter at nearly light speed. Most pass through a person, a wall, or a boulder without interacting, but not all. In thick stone, enough collide to leave a countable difference. Place detectors below and around a target, track counts and directions, and then reconstruct a density image the way doctors use X-rays to see bone. The resolution is not fine enough to read inscriptions or find a small niche, but it can reveal voids on the scale of meters, and it can do so without touching the stone. Published visuals place the big void above the Grand Gallery, on a line that mirrors the gallery itself. The rough length spans many meters, perhaps as long as a train car or more, though limits of resolution make exact shapes slippery. Its orientation aligns with the internal path of the pyramid, not with a random fracture. That alignment matters. Geology can create pockets and seams where layers meet, or when materials compress unevenly. Architecture tends to trace straight lines and symmetries. The current map suggests something more linear than chaotic, more corridor than bubble, yet the data leaves room to argue. It always does. There are other hints. Ground-penetrating radar has probed the plateau around Khafra's pyramid and the West Cemetery, returning reflections that look like cavities. Some line up with known tombs and mastabas, which helps test the method. Others appear where no entrance is recorded. Radar, like Muon's, reads physics, not intent. Wet sand, changing moisture or rubble can make a pattern shine or die. A layer of loose fill can mimic an empty room. Bedrock layers can echo at odd angles. So each signal invites a round of ground truth. A core sample, a fibre optic look, a careful brush across dust to find a joint that a hand has not touched in centuries. In the gap between signals and certainty, stories grow. Some whisper of hidden libraries sealed against fire and flood, archives of plant-based scrolls that could not survive time unless stone guarded them. Others imagine cache spaces where transitional tools were stored, prototypes or master gauges that would explain the tightness of joints seen elsewhere. Critics counter that stress relief spaces need nothing except geometry. Multiple king's chambers feature layered ceilings and relieving spaces that were never meant for people. In that view, the new voids are clever emptiness, engineering that functions by staying empty and inaccessible. One field engineer rubs a thumb across a block face near a sealed seam and shakes his head. He points to the way a newer patch of fine limestone feathers into an older step, a join so subtle that wind carries a slight temperature difference across it at night. Another day, a conservator keys a note in the margin of an inspection report. She marks a ripple in mortar along a corner of a passage, coarse crystal beside fine paste, like two recipes from two kitchens applied to the same wall. These tactile notes are not proof of phase changes and renovations, but they are the kind of small data that makes larger models feel less like stories and more like progress. Beyond the main monuments, the plateau holds voids that are less argued. Some serve as tomb shafts. Some are drainage routes cut where surface water would collect in rare storms. A few seem to lead nowhere. In the low light of dawn, a guard talks softly about rooms that breathe in winter and go still in summer. A draft that shifts the flame of his lighter as he checks latches. There is a human scale to this map of air and stone. Roads and stairways for the living, shafts and chambers for the dead, and somewhere between those purposes, spaces that have not yet been named. The idea of underground cities sounds like a story from another land, yet the thought comes to mind when the map grows dense with cavities and corridors. Supporters suggest that in times of heat or conflict, people might have used subsurface rooms as cool shelters or workspaces, or that older communities carved into the bedrock first and built above later, the way some desert cultures retrofitted caves into homes and storage. Others dismiss this as a leap beyond the evidence. Ventilation, light, and access become hard problems underground. Known substructures near Giza tend to prioritise burial and ritual. The practicalities of daily life are usually found on the surface, where courtyards and hearths leave clearer traces. The non-invasive tools take on the slow work that human feet cannot. As Muon counts accumulate, the image quality climbs. With long exposures, noise fades and shapes clarify. From a different angle, a second detector confirms the brighter streak above the grand gallery, and the rough dimensions fall within the same bands as earlier scans. The numbers agree even as interpretations diverge. One engineer smiles with his eyes when the graphs overprint in near alignment. Through a pane of glass in the control room, you can see the desert edge where the city starts. Traffic makes a low thread of sound that barely reaches here. Stone swallows most of it. Conservative explanations keep their feet on the ground. Builders could have cut an internal void to reduce stress on the steep high gallery below. They could have left an access corridor during construction, and then sealed it as load shifted. Weight-relieving voids above the king's chamber are a famous example of practical emptiness. If the newly mapped space is an echo of that practice, along a different axis, it would be a detail rather than a revelation. Yet a detail on that scale suggests a level of planning that maps air as carefully as stone. That, in itself, tightens the picture of the builder's knowledge of how their structure behaved under gravity. Outside, on the north side of the plateau, ground teams have tested radar and electrical resistivity in grids over the sand behind rows of mastabas. The results show bands where the signal drops as if it entered a cavity, then rose after passing. One trench revealed a collapsed shaft that had been disguised by drifted sand and blown crust. Another revealed only a misunderstanding of soil moisture. The process is a reminder that absence can be misread as intention. A void is a void until someone finds its edges and its purpose. Until then, maps are sketches, and sketches invite erasures. In the quiet hours, speculation aims higher. Some whisper of sealed repositories tucked into the core, built before outer layers went up. If so, access would have to be planned from the start and then removed when the last stones were set. They point to the small doors found at the ends of some air shafts, as if to say, look, a motif of closure. Critics counter that those doors likely regulated airflow during construction or bore symbolic weight, closing the path for the pharaoh's spirit. None of it is settled. The measured part of the work keeps counting, keeps placing detectors in new positions to cross-check the picture. In one lab, a young physicist flips through raw Muon counts on thin paper printouts, the kind that curl at the edges. She pauses at a column that runs out of range before it should. She checks the calibration. She takes a sip of coffee gone cold. On one edge of the page, she draws a simple pyramid outline and marks the path of the particles with a dotted pencil line, then places a small box above the gallery in the drawing. She does not label it. She knows better than to name a thing before the data names it. Another idea, quieter but persistent, is that earlier communities used natural cavities below the plateau. The area has knuckles of limestone laid down in uneven beds. Groundwater once cut through in places, leaving pockets. Later generations could have widened those pockets into storage rooms or ritual spaces. If so, modern scans might be reading old geology nudged into service rather than fully human-made halls. It's a modest proposal, it still leaves a pattern of space where we did not expect it, and a narrative thread that ties use across time. Instruments are indifferent to age, a void that dates to the original construction, and a void widened in the late period looks similar in a Muon map. That uncertainty opens a lane for multiple histories stacked like thin pages. Dynasties building, later caretakers repairing, others tunnelling, probing, learning the inside routes the way city kids learn alleys. The big void, in this lens, could be an inheritance from one phase to the next. Or it could be a hidden dimension planned from the first course, whose purpose sits just outside our current vocabulary. Both possibilities leave the pyramid feeling less like a final object and more like a long project with phases. All the while, access proposals cross desks. Some suggest a small borehole angled from an existing passage, just wide enough for an endoscope to enter the bright zone on the scan. Others prefer more time with non-invasive tools, more counts, more angles, fewer chances to leave scars. The debate is polite but firm. One path favours discovery sooner, the other favours caution and the dignity of an old structure that has no voice in our arguments. The desert is patient, so are stones, people less so. You linger on the engineer's pen, tapping at the rectangular glow. The tap slows and stops. He lifts the pen and looks up as if listening to something outside the room. There is only the low burr of the cooling fan and the soft tread of someone passing in the corridor. The picture on the screen updates again and brightens in one corner, as if the space inside the pyramid just breathed a little deeper. It did not, of course, but the feeling lands and it stays. What the instruments agree on is slim but solid. There is more empty space than old maps promise. It is not random, and it appears in more than one place. The maps narrow where and how large. They do not tell why. Above the Grand Gallery is the brightest node on that modern constellation. Others dot the periphery where we seldom look, and somewhere in the West Cemetery, radar lines hold hints of rooms near earlier tombs. Not enough to dig, enough to mark and watch. Out on the plateau, a ranger sweeps sand from a faint groove at the base of a block and finds a swallow's nest made from mud and straw hardened like pottery. He sighs and leaves it be. Across the day, tourists flow and ebb. Cameras click and then rest. The pyramid glows as the light swings round. Beneath, the instruments continue. Patterns pool on screens. The unknown keeps the same shape long enough to earn a name, but not long enough to give up its purpose. If the dynasties entered a landscape already thick with caverns, conduits, and load-managed emptiness, their project might have included more than building. It might have included learning what was already there and bending it to new ends. A scribe chiselling his king's name into a dressed block would be part of that line. So would an architect who traced air as carefully as stone. Under that view, the scans do not threaten the official story. They give it a second layer, one where invention and inheritance meet in a maze of stone and shadow, waiting for the next careful eye. A reed lamp throws a small warm circle on the wall. A scribe leans into a block that seems older than the room around it. Bronze chisel biting slow and sure. His stroke is steady, but the stone is slick where many hands have passed, its face smoothed as if centuries wore it down before his name ever existed. Each tap rings with a hollow note, different from the limestone nearby, as if this piece came from another story and was moved here to be claimed. He wipes grit with the heel of his hand. The cartouche grows, clean and confident, a royal oval cut into a surface that carries faint scars he did not make. The idea that kings sometimes inherited more than they built lives in these small moments. Later reigns often repaired, resurfaced, or repurposed older structures. That habit could explain why one wall bears crisp hieroglyphs, while the next shows uneven joints and tooling that feels out of sync with the inscription date. Some whisper that officials wanted the prestige of ancient stone under their names. Others suggest it was practical. Good blocks were valuable, and rebuilding on established foundations saved time. You can stand in a corridor and see two tones of masonry meet. A pale new face feathered into a darker, worn core, like an edit in the rock. A conservator working along a causeway runs a fingertip over mortar that changes colour within a few spans. One seam smells chalky and fresh when wetted, the other stays inert, almost waxy. The grain of sand shifts too, coarse inclusions in one joint, finer paste in the next. It reads like dialects, two recipes applied at different hours, maybe different eras. The mason's plumb lines still hang straight, but the wall tells you it is a collage. Right beside it, a block shows polished hardness that makes copper tools glance away. The next block takes a scratch easily. That contrast presses the question, who set this mix, and when? There are names for the practice of taking and making a piece one's own. Usurpation is one term you hear, erasing and recarving earlier inscriptions to match the current king. Reused blocks, sometimes from dismantled temples, appear in new builds. Small standardized stones from one period show up as fill-in later monuments. At Giza, quarry faces reveal sequences, cutbacks, and ledges that suggest long campaigns of extraction. You can trace lifts in the rock where crews advance layer by layer, then see a pause carved by flood seasons or political turns. The stone remembers a schedule that outlived individual reigns. Walk to Abydos and the contrast grows. The chamber below with its heavy granite and quiet pool sits beside a decorated temple full of carved scenes. The styles don't quarrel, but they don't speak the same tongue either. Upright pillars with simple, massive lines stand close to finer reliefs, cut into more workable stone above. The junction does not hide itself. It looks like a place revered, and then framed. Old bones dressed with newer skin. At Sahara, broad old kingdom walls meet later restorations, layers of masonry and alternating textures. A visitor notices saw-like chatter on one surface, and hand-smoothed plaster on the next, as if technique and intent shifted between crews. This creates tension, because the monuments bear inscriptions that tie them to specific kings and periods. Names, dates, dedications. They anchor history. Yet the tool marks don't always sit politely beneath those labels. Some joints run so true they vanish at an arm's length. Others break line and depth within the same course. Supporters suggest this patchwork points to a layered life. Original core work from one time, repairs and claims from another, formal dedications from yet another. Critics counter that mixed appearances arise naturally in large projects. Teams with different skills, changing stone quality, and variable weather can create uneven effects without reaching across centuries. A field notebook from a quarry edge notes lift marks on granite that match sled grooves miles away. It also notes stray blocks in village walls built from temple debris. When stones migrate, they bring their scars, A reused block can carry earlier tooling, which then sits beside fresh inscriptions. Talented hands can harmonise the face, but once the surface chips, the older story peeks through. In museums, you sometimes see an erased name panel, smoothed and recut, the new sign just lightly offset from the original. The chisel reveals a ghost underneath when light hits at a low angle. Consider the choice of material. Copper edges dull fast on hard stone. Still, we find granite and even harder igneous pieces placed where softer options would have sufficed. Was it symbolic weight? Durability? Supporters suggest that choosing the most stubborn rock hints at methods, abrasives, repetitive polishing, or techniques we do not fully reconstruct, that exceed the simple image of soft metal against hard mineral. Critics counter that patience and sand cut anything given enough time. The truth may lean on both. You can grind granite with grit and water for days until it mirrors back, but to do it at scale in buried chambers presses the logistics. A restorer ties this back to phasing. She points out how thresholds are often replaced, the most walked stones renewed while uprights endure. In one passage, the lower courses show rounded wear like steps softened by countless feet. Then sharp inserts bridge the sag. Mortar lines here are clean, precise, newer. Above, faint red layout lines still cling to older blocks. The construction sketch no one bothered to scrub. It reads like a building that had a long life, not a single burst. A chapel restored in one reign can carry the soul of an earlier frame, like a palimpsest you can touch. At Giza, quarry sequencing helps build a timeline of extraction. Shelves indicate where men cut faces, then broke off blocks, leaving telltale cups and holes from levers. The slope of the quarry steps lines up with transport ramps that once fed the plateau. Over time, these scars layer like growth rings. Mixed into surrounding cemeteries, reused stones appear in mastabas that used to sit clean but now show spolia, embedded pieces from another structure. It may not prove a lost civilization. It does show a culture comfortable with recycling sacred material into new sacred shapes, binding present rule to deep time. A small case at Sahara shows a relief panel whose name was hammered out and replaced. The work is good, but a thin ridge betrays the cut. Elsewhere, blocks with standardized dimensions from one period turn up as fill behind later decorative walls. Builders knew the sizes, the fit, the way to stack from memory. That habit blurs lines for us now. We want clear start and stop dates. The stone offers edits. You can hear the echo in the chisel rings, sharp here, dull there, as if even sound maps the mixture. Opposing views lay out the stakes. Mainstream archaeology sets construction of the big works in the Old Kingdom, with names, tombs, workers' quarters, and administrative records anchoring that timeline. Critics dismiss the idea of a wholly earlier build, noting that context aligns across site layers. Supporters suggest that even if the grand structure was completed in that era, phases and restorations could reach back further, or at least pull older elements into new cores. The debate doesn't vanish under new scans or fresh surveys, it adapts, like a wall rebuilt on surviving footings. A craftsman today, visiting on a weekend, runs a steel straight edge across a granite face and whistles softly. The line holds for almost the length of his arm. He knows copper would struggle. He also knows that abrasives and time can create wonders. He points out a shallow bowl where grit likely pooled, making one spot smoother than the rest. Patience leaves clues, regular striations lapped gloss, corners trued by repeated checks. The uncertainty sits in the margin. How many hands, how many seasons, how much knowledge passed down without writing? In Abydos, the lower chamber's plain strength feels older than the ornate temple above. The two are bound by water and ritual now, but their textures diverge. One carries inscriptions and intricate scenes. The other leans on mass and right angles. It's tempting to draw a long line through that contrast. Better to say the site holds stages. The upper work honours and frames, the lower anchors and endures. That pairing appears elsewhere. Even at Saqqara, You find heavy cores wrapped by later corridors, like someone added a sleeve to preserve a cherished spine. So the story that fits both sets of fingerprints is hybrid. Builders and caretakers, separated by time, contributed to the same horizon of stone. Names on walls, yes. Also, method traces in the joints, quarry maps in the cliffs, mortar recipes in hairline seams. This way of seeing does not flatten the achievements we can date. It gives them neighbours on either side. It allows a scribe's fresh cartouche to rest on a face worn smooth, without forcing the past to pick one author. Under that lens, the question about hard stone becomes a clue rather than a contradiction. If a culture with copper tools chose granite and diorite, maybe they paired soft metal with plentiful sand, powdered quartz, and relentless repetition. Or maybe certain tasks had specialised tricks now lost. Some whisper about guided tooling or jigs that hold steady angles. Others counter that simple tools in trained hands produce repeatable accuracy. The blocks do not confess. They let your fingers find the ridge where two ages meet and offer no dates. The lamp near our scribe burns lower. He blows on the chisel edge to clear dust and closes the oval around his king's name. The mark claims the stone, but the stone keeps its older voice beneath. A wall can carry two truths and still stand. Under the same constellations far from the Nile, there are other places where fresh cuts sit on old faces, and the echoes start to line up. Night settles over a low ridge in southeastern Turkey. The air holds a thin chill, the kind that tightens the skin along your forearms. Torches move in a slow arc, a hush of flame against dark limestone. The ground crunches under boots. White dust clings to pants and laces. In the glow, T-shaped pillars rise out of the hill like fossil bones, tall and clean-lined, their faces carved with animals that seem to step forward when the light passes. A crane stands etched in shallow relief. A fox runs along a smooth edge that feels almost warm after a day's heat. These stones have watched more than 10,000 winters. The night makes them feel awake. You walk a circle. Each enclosure holds paired pillars at the centre, taller than the rest, their tops like lintels without a roof. The curve of the ring is measured so tightly that your steps fall into a rhythm. Not a city, not a farm. A ring. One of many. A thin breeze slides across the plateau and carries a trace of crushed thyme and dusted lime. Tools rest in neat rows near the trench. Trowels, brushes, a tape measure that flashes dull metal when it snaps open. A field worker kneels by that carved fox, gloved hand steady, as the tape ticks along a pillar's edge. Sand grits under the glove. The corner is crisp enough to snag the fibre and pull a thread. By daylight, the site is brighter than you expect. The bedrock has been cut into shallow basins that hold the pillars, and stone sockets fit their bases with care. Some of these T-shapes weigh as much as a modest truck, yet their lines are consistent, their faces level. The hill itself is a man-made mound, layers of backfill and compacted earth, as if each structure was used and then buried on purpose. People walk the lines with small flags to mark features. You can hear the click of a lens cap, the rustle of paper maps, the low voice of someone counting off distances. The cadence feels like a ritual of its own. Measure, record, brush, repeat. No plough furrows trace these slopes. No pottery kilns stand nearby. But the stones bind the place together like a spine. The dates reach back so far the numbers feel like a language from another world. Radiocarbon samples from the deepest layers point toward a time around 9600 BCE for the early rings, with the later layers stacked like pages that grew younger as the site rose. That is the part that makes the stomach drop a little. We are used to monuments arriving late, after grain, after houses, after a map of streets. Here the sequence bends. You get stone circles first, then, in other lands and other ages, the farms and walls. Some whisper this flip hints at an older memory carried forward. Critics counter you can gather as hunters and still raise markers that mean something, and that ritual places often grow before storehouses. A field worker dusts a carved vulture wing. careful not to smear a ridge that took hours to clean. The feather barbs show shallow lines etched with a steady hand. A second pair of hands holds a notebook open against the wind, thumb pressed against the spine. The note reads simple: height, angle, relief depth. The team keeps the language plain. The stones do the talking. Nearby, a basket of spoil earth tips out to reveal chips of limestone, bone fragments, and a scatter of flint. Nothing here screams city. And yet the organisation is obvious in the layout, the repeated forms, the effort to move and set heavy stone. Someone planned this, returned to it, and then covered it. Far to the southwest, where the desert today rolls flat and dry, a shallow basin once held water and grass. Nabta Playa sits in that long quiet bowl. The night there can still cool a copper cup left on a rock, and in the day heat shakes the horizon. You stand at dawn beside a small circle of stones. They are not huge, and yet their layout holds a quiet force. Lines extend to mark the path of the sun at its turning. A simple ring frames a view where the horizon becomes a calendar. Many summers ago the sunrise crested at the same notch. The circle marked it, then kept marking it as seasons turned and years stacked. An elder could point and say, "Wait for that light, then move. It is a clean idea made of rock and sky. The wider landscape fills in the context." During the African humid period, monsoon rains moved north. Lakes formed where sand now lies. Grasses, trees and herds drew people in, and then drew them onward as seasons turned. You can still see from orbit the ghost paths of old channels. Down at the ground you feel it in small ways. The roundness of a worn pebble in a place it doesn't belong. A crust of fossil algae on a rock cut. The air holds no scent of water now, but a memory of it lives in the earth. In that greener Sahara, a cluster of stones at Nabta was more than an art piece. It was a tool. Repeatable, durable, anchored to the sky. Back in Turkey, someone sets a plumb line beside a pillar. The string sways, then steadies. A line is drawn in pencil. Another set of hands checks the compass, adjusting for the drift that comes with a metal buckle, then steps back. The sight is not random. The circles, while varied, follow a pulse of planning. The carvings are not doodles. Fox, boar, crane, serpent. Each appears with care, sometimes paired in ways that echo across the rings. You wonder about the people who carried the pillars into place, what they ate, where they slept, what story they told when the ring was done. The dig silent except for the crunch of soil and a distant dog. Civilization does not always leave city walls. Sometimes it leaves a circle. At Nabta, a small group arrives after a long walk. It is a mini-story you can see without seeing. A camp sets near a shallow lake that no longer exists. Fires crackle with dry brush. A child skips flat stones across ripples while the oldest watches the sky. The group knows the circle well. They are just a marker stone that shifted in last season's wind. They check the sunrise line. They tell the younger ones where to stand when the star first peaks. You can hear laughter, the scrape of a pot, and the heavy breath of a cow at night. The circle holds their year together. When to move, when to stay. It is not a cathedral, but it is not nothing. It ties them to the rhythm outside the body. Some see this and say, here is proof you can plan big before you plant fields. You can push stone, carve art, and follow the sky with enough hands and a shared purpose. Others dismiss that leap, arguing that ritual hubs spring up among foragers all the time and do not require permanent settlements, governance, or stored grain. Both lines have weight. The stones do not explain their own meaning, and we are left to read their angles and dates. What stands firm is the coordination. Rope was cut, labour was timed, transport was organised, and tools were made and maintained. In cold air under a night sky, that coordination feels like the point. A conservator in a portable lab runs a fingertip along a weathered groove from one of the pillars, then checks the magnified image on a small screen. Tool marks show abrasion, not high-speed cutting. Limestone gives up under steady pressure and grit. The result is still clean. This is not a call to mythical machines. It is a record of hands and patience. Yet the output, the scale, the repetition, the burial and rebuilding nudges at a bigger frame. Supporters suggest a network of seasonal groups could meet here, share knowledge, and move ideas along trails, seeding techniques across wide distances without a single city to claim them. At the playa, a line of stones extends beyond the circle. Some alignments point toward the point of the sun at solstice. Others may echo star risings that mattered to later cultures along the Nile. Critics counter that small groups can set these lines with careful watching over years, and that statistical chance can mimic intent. They caution against reading too much from too little. The caution is fair, but when you stand there, toes in coarse sand, you feel how simple tools can fold sky into ground. A stick for a sight line, a rock as a marker, a rhythm of return. The lake draws you back, the sunrise tells you when. At the hill with the rings, you pause by a pillar whose top edges are softened by time but still straight along the long face. An old note in the site log records that the surrounding fill was poured back by ancient hands, layer upon layer, as if someone closed a chapter and pressed the page flat. It's an odd habit, to build, use and bury. The act keeps the form safe like a seed in a jar. It suggests a cycle, not a one-off. A return, not a departure. Supporters suggest that this cycle points to planning beyond a season, beyond a single hunter's life, a design to stitch generations into a story the stones can carry. You keep moving and the ground underfoot changes from packed earth to a pale crust where salts come up in the dry. The torches burn lower, the sky deepens. You can feel the weight of the date ranges without saying the numbers again. It is enough to know the early layers belong to a world colder in places, wetter in others, and not yet filled with the cities we expect. You picture lines mapped on the inside of someone's skull, the habit of counting steps, the habit of following stars. You wonder how long it takes to teach that. A parent's hand guiding a child's eye to the same notch on the horizon, year after year, until the notch belongs to both of them. If the standard ladder says farms first, then temples, this hill and that playa draw a different sketch. Here, stonework and sky maps rise from groups that moved and then met again. It does not blow up the whole story. It bends it. It adds a hinge. The hinge holds the idea that a shared calendar can be the seed for larger builds, that art can be a tool, that a ring can be a town's worth of cooperation, even if everyone sleeps elsewhere. In the dark, this version feels natural. People need times to meet, times to trade, to choose mates, to settle quarrels, to mourn. A ring of stone can fix those times to the sky so no one argues the date. The wind picks up. A banner at the edge of the site slaps and then settles. The crew zips bags and clicks off headlamps, leaving a last pool of light around the tape measure still hooked on a pillar edge. The field worker who measured the fox stands and flexes stiff knees, then runs a thumb again along the carved fur as if to say goodnight. This is a small human act in a long human project. You can feel the years in it. The oldest rings keep giving tasks to the living. That too is a sign of planning. A pipeline of care reaching across centuries. Back at Nabta, the circle goes dark under a clean sky. When the summer sun returns to its marked point, a story will restart. For now, it waits. Waiting is part of the design. The circle is a device that uses time as a moving part. Every year wins the mechanism and test whether the stone still makes sense. The simplicity of that test makes it strong. It taught lessons when the Sahara held lakes and grass. It can still teach in a desert. By dawn, both places find their edges again in light. You look from those early rings and that small circle back to the plateau where a different kind of stone story rises. The lesson so far is not grand or loud. It is practical. The timeline flexes. Coordination came early. Precision did not wait for walls and taxes. And if careful hands could pull meaning from sky and rock here, then the next chapter, built in square blocks and tight seams, may not be as sudden as it seems. The path from circles under stars to impossible straight lines may be shorter than we think. Dawn sits low on the plateau. You stand at the edge of Khufu's base while a surveyor tightens a clamp on a tripod. The air is cool enough to keep your breath close. Stone holds the night's chill and sends it back through your shoes. The city wakes a mile away with a soft rattle of scooters and the faint smell of diesel. But here the only sound is the soft scrape of a levelling foot, a click, then a nod. The line in the instrument's glass steadies. The corner block across the way hardly moves. Doesn't have to. It already knows where north is. Hard numbers anchor this ground. The sides of the Great Pyramid sit within a few arc minutes of true north, just a sliver of a degree. The base plane drifts only centimetres over more than 5 hectares of footprint. Corners land within narrow tolerances that stay tight even when traced today with total stations and GPS. You can run a line along the east side and keep it straight through the rising heat. The math does not sway. It's baked into the platform, a quiet decision in limestone that survived every century that followed. Now come the tools you'd expect in the Old Kingdom. Cord that stretches when the air gets damp, plumb bobs that sway, sighting rods that rely on a steady hand and a steady eye. Those work. They're real. The puzzle isn't whether they could aim, it's whether they could repeat a tiny angle across hundreds of meters in a world without precision steel. How do you push error down to minutes of arc and keep it there while men chip, drag and set? Even small slips grow when scaled to the size of a town square. A mason's hand brushes a fragment of Tura casing where the mantle once shone. The polish is long gone, beaten by time and theft, but the straightness still runs like a rule pressed into cream limestone. Joints meet so tight you have to look for the seam. The mason taps the edge with a fingernail and listens for the click. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't have to. Flatness is a language you hear as much as you see. Survey reports over the last century keep circling the same numbers. Orientation sits within a handful of arc minutes. Base deviation stays small, measured in centimetres over long runs. Those reports don't argue style or purpose. They just draw lines and publish angles. Again and again, modern resurveys confirm the old ones. This site responds like a quiet instrument that's still in tune. There's comfort in that, and a touch of unease. Accuracy that refuses to drift invites more questions. Mainstream methods offer a path. You can find north by watching stars that circle the pole and marking their transit points. Equal altitude tricks at dusk and dawn give the same line from two opposite skies. A plumb line turns the eye into a datum. Each method is sound. None requires magic. Yet there's a catch that whispers at the edge, hitting minutes of arc, on schedule, under dust and wind, while your reference points crawl with the slow precession of Earth's axis. That dance needs more than a single night under clear skies. It needs habits, routines, and a tolerance for waiting until the air settles and the view stops trembling. Think about aligning a football field to a laser line using only the night sky and string. You can get close with care. Now push it until the error falls within the width of a thumb at the far end. Then double the field, set it on a slight slope, and keep the team working while the line holds. The example is modern, but the point sits in the stone. The pyramid wears a standard that rarely shows up by accident. Measurements of the base keep a steady rhythm. The north side runs a hair longer than the south, the east a shade off the west, but the drift falls within tight bounds when you scale the shape. Corner sockets and bedrock cutouts speak to a plan that controlled height and edge before the first course rose. When engineers walked the perimeter with modern instruments, they found the old plan alive under their feet. You can see it in the way the casing bed still defines a near-perfect plane even with the mantle gone. The tools at hand could reach this, critics counter, if used with discipline and time. Wet string can reduce sag. Repeated star shots refine the line. A long baseline smears out local errors. Those are fair arguments. They live inside physics, not outside it. Supporters suggest the repeatability at this scale hints at a surveying tradition with deep memory. If so, the tradition leaves little paper and a lot of stone, The stone is the paper that survived. Inside the debate, the most stubborn facts are the least romantic. Angular deviation, elevation variance, joint tolerance. The numbers hold under fresh surveys and new methods. Laser scanners, prisms and total stations keep coming back with the same small errors. The kind you have to squint to see. This isn't an opinion about greatness. It's a report about angles. Even skeptics grant the math. Out on the plateau, a worker presses a steel ruler along a surviving casing bed and runs a pencil mark across a nick. The graphite skids. He wipes dust from his nose with the back of his wrist. Nearby, a guide pours a small splash of water on a line of mortar and watches it bead. Little acts meet old stone. That's where the question lives. In hands, not in slogans. There's also the matter of consistency across features built in the same horizon of time. The causeway plots a clean vector, the sockets level like a poured slab, the corner foundations seat into bedrock with little drift. It isn't one perfect trick for one facade. It's a survey language applied across an entire site. The weight of it builds quietly. Each measurement nudges the mind forward, from belief to mechanism. You can choose a method from the standard kit. Sighting past a pair of circumpolar stars at equal altitude can yield true north. Set your pillars, carve your sighting notch, wait for the sky to mirror itself around the pole. Do it again next season, record the midpoint, build when the mark stops moving. None of this breaks the known tool chain, but it does demand patience, practice, and a team that treats drift like a personal insult. If you crouch and run your palm over the bedrock at the northeast corner, you feel small rises where tool marks still kiss the surface. They're not pretty, they're just honest. Rough ground dressing paired with fine edge control. That contrast tells a story of priorities. Energy spent exactly where it pays off, saved where it doesn't. It feels like a field manual written in limestone. There's a temptation to call this an isolated wonder. It isn't, at least not here. The precision shows up in the plane and the angle, in the way the core stepped inward to support casing that now lives in other buildings. It shows up in baselines that track the cardinal points like a compass that never shakes. The pyramid doesn't shout. It shrugs and holds its line. So where does that leave the argument? The math holds, which means the task shifts. We move from whether to how, from claims to procedures, from awe to workflow. That's a calmer place to stand. It's also harder because it asks for a tool chain that can be traced step by step without waving away the tolerances that make people pause. The surveyor at your side folds the tripod and rubs a thumb across the knurled knob. He glances at the horizon, then at the corner, as if checking a friend's old scar. The line will be here tomorrow. It will be here long after we're gone. Precision like this ages slowly. It invites a second puzzle right underfoot. Down the river and under the desert, other stones wait with their own tolerances, their own sharp edges and slick faces. Some are not on the surface at all. They sit in shadowed halls where a beam of light can run unbroken along a wall of granite. We turn from open sky and flat plains toward narrow passages and black polish, where touch becomes the only ruler you trust. Down in the long passage at Sahara, the air feels cool even in late afternoon heat. The floor under your boots turns from dust to bedrock, then to a smoother path cut straight through the earth. A technician kneels beside a granite box that fills most of the chamber. He feeds a fibre optic light through a narrow gap at the lid's edge. The beam travels along the interior wall and returns as a clean, bright line, as if the stone were a mirror that swallowed the light and handed it back without a ripple. The box is not small. It is a block of granite weighing many tons, with a lid that might weigh as much as a truck. The corners meet tightly. The interior faces look flat and square to the eye, and the lid rests so close to the rim that daylight has a hard time finding any seam. The room is quiet. Only a hint of grit underfoot and the low rasp of the fibre line sliding against stone. You reach toward the wall and feel that strange finish. Not glossy like glass, but true and even. The kind of flat that turns the beam into a ruler drawn by light. The Serapeum holds a line of these boxes. made of granite brought from far to the south, ferried and hauled here, then worked underground to a finish that reads as deliberate and controlled. Each lid sits on a shallow rebate, a lip cut into the rim so the cover nests, not just rests. The lid edges are straight and heavy. When the light skims the interior, you catch the squareness in shadow, corners that snap into right angles without soft rounding. It is an odd feeling, seeing such careful geometry in a place that smells like earth and old air. Now the problem arrives in your head like a drum beat. With copper tools and abrasive sand, how do you bring a wall this flat and a corner this true on a vessel that weighs tens of tons inside a cut rock hallway? The answer offered in guidebooks leans on patience and time. It suggests teams rubbing, grinding, lapping with wet sand and grit. That explanation fits some tasks, but it moves slowly when the material is granite and the target is a mirror-flat interior face measured across several feet. A machinist on his off day comes with a straight edge and a set of feeler strips. He sets the metal bar along the interior wall, then slides the thinnest leaf at the midpoint. It snags. He shifts an inch and tries again. The gap he finds is small, the sort measured in fractions of a millimetre. He doesn't say much. He only nods at the regularity, then points to the corner where two faces meet without a visible belly or hollow. What we can note without argument are the things the eyes and fingers confirm. The walls read as flat across long spans. The corners resolve into tight 90-degree junctions. The lid and the rim meet with a narrow and consistent line. Granite of this grade comes from quarries upriver, the same region known for other heavy works. The distance from quarry to site is long. The task of moving such mass by river and road is significant. Then placing it in a trench-like corridor with enough room to lift, lower and seat. Critics counter that patient abrasion can build this finish if you scale up labour and time. They point to copper tube drills with sand, to stone saws with grit, to lapping plates and pumice. They note that a mirror is not required for the look we see here. A very fine abrasive can give a surface sheen. That is plausible, and parts of it have been shown in small-scale tests. Supporters suggest that the consistency of surfaces and the regularity of edges hint at more guided technique. They whisper about feed rate signatures on related artifacts, and about polishes that seem too even for hand-only motion. The truth sits in the dark, in the fine difference between could and did. Measurements matter. Early surveyors wrote about flatness and right angles. Modern engineers who visit often carry gauges and straight edges instead of tripods. They describe interior faces that reject light except at a narrow edge. They remark on the separation between lid and box, so close that a fingertip can barely sense the join. The boxes are not rough on the inside. They are finished in a way that reads methodical, and the finish holds even as the granite changes grain or colour across a panel. Function is another open door. Mainstream labels call these sarcophagi tied to a burial cult that venerated sacred bulls. That label makes sense in the story of the site. Others dismiss a pure funerary role, pointing to the lack of inscriptions on many boxes and the expense of such precision, if the aim were only ritual containment. The chamber planning, the weight of the lids, and the smooth interiors encourage more questions than answers. Supporters suggest roles that might demand tight fits and flat faces. Critics reply that we risk reading modern needs into ancient practice. Transport also raises its own set of steps. Granite this dense comes from Aswan, implying quarrying there and river passage north. The Nile floods would help, allowing heavy barges to ride high water. From the river edge to this trench is not a short stroll. It would have required causeways or tracks, teams and levers, and careful descent into the underground passage. The mere act of lowering a 70-ton block into this space asks for a choreography that leaves little room for error, and yet the edges arrived unchipped, the seams intact. A case study mindset helps. Observers like Petrie once noted tooling marks on granite cores and saw cuts in other contexts. Engineers today compare those notes with what the boxes show. a difference between exterior roughing and interior finishing that suggests phases of work with different aims. If the interior was lapped with large flat rubbers, you would expect certain patterns. If guides were used to hold a path true, you would expect others. The surfaces here do not speak loudly, but under a grazing light they offer hints of regular motion. Across the ancient landscape you find echoes, tight seams in other sites, large blocks with clean beds, and interiors that seem trued rather than only smoothed. Supporters suggest these are part of a pattern of high control stonework that crosses time and dynasty. Critics counter that we notice only the exceptional, and that countless rougher works never make the highlight reel. Both notes can be true. The boxes remain present, cold to the touch, exact in their quiet way. In the end, whether you read these as ritual containers, as something technical, or simply as masterpieces of ancient labour, the tolerances stand. They demand a toolchain that can deliver flat, square and smooth at scale in granite underground. They push you to account for planning, for power, whether human, animal, water or something else, and for the steady hand that holds a line true when the margin for error is almost nothing. The technician eases the light back out and switches it off. The beam fades, your eyes adjust and the stone returns to its matte grey calm. Up above, daylight rolls across the plateau. Down here, the question deepens. We can measure the walls, we can trace the edges. The method, and the reason, still sit out of reach like a lid that will not quite lift. The corridor breathes its cold breath, and your mind moves ahead to the lion-shaped sentinel carved in bedrock. If these interiors hold a record of skill and time, what might weather on an open body say about the ages that passed over it? The path tilts toward a face that wears the memory of rain. You stand at the enclosure's edge before dawn, the air cool and slightly damp, the limestone giving off a faint chalk smell. A geologist beside you runs a hand along a wall as tall as a house. The grooves aren't scoured sideways like wind would do. They fall straight down the face, rounded and soft at the edges, as if water once slid over the stone again and again. His fingers pause on a swell in the bedrock where layers have peeled back like old paint, each curve catching a shadow in the early light. The reading he favours is simple to state and hard to accept. Prolonged rainfall cuts this kind of vertical channeling. It asks for a wetter climate, not a quick storm. He points toward the horizon, where the desert once held savanna and lakes during a greener phase. In that window, long before the dunes took over, rainstorms could last and return season after season. If those lines were made then, the sculpture that anchors this enclosure may belong to a time that leans older than the standard dates. Older means wetter. Wetter means the desert had not yet hardened into its present shape. Not far away, the context makes another case. Egyptologists tie the monument to Khafra's era, noting the quarry traces that blend into his causeway and the style they read in the face and surrounding plan. They walk with you through cut marks in bedrock and block placements that link the Sphinx temple to the pyramid complex. They also note that erosion can have several sources here. Windborne sand that bluffs stone bit by bit, salts that crystallise and flake the surface, and groundwater that rises, enters pores, then leaves behind a crust that crumbles. You can see it as you pass, a rough bloom of exfoliation on some blocks above the carved floor. An on-site conservator crouches with a small brush and a flashlight, tracing a blister where salt has pushed a thin sheet of limestone away from the face. She taps the crust and it falls with a dry click, revealing powder beneath. Then her eyes wander to the enclosure's lower walls, where curves look older, more rounded, as if time chewed there first. She doesn't make a speech. She just marks a note in pencil, circles an area where the bedrock swells, and takes a photo in the bland light of morning. The difference between vertical channels and wind scouring matters. Wind ablation chews laterally, undercuts, sharpens edges, and tends to etch at heights where the flow concentrates. Rain on soft limestone runs down in sheets, carving flutes and scoops in vertical paths. You can trace several down the enclosure where they join and widen, linked like little rivers cut into stone. Competing geological papers lay out methods. Some measure the geometry of hollows, others model rainfall rates versus erosion on this particular limestone member, while critics map wind corridors and salt-laden airflow from the plateau to suggest another kind of wear. The terms get dry on the page, but here, with your palm on the rock, they feel immediate. Push the frame to climate. The African humid period brought a long stretch of greener conditions to North Africa. Lake basins across the Sahara held water, and rivers ran where only sand runs today. In cores from nearby deltas and lakes, proxies for rainfall rise and fall in bands that chart the shift. If the enclosure's deep channels need years of steady rain, they point toward a segment of that humid span, not to one exact date, but to a climate regime that could carry storms across this plateau often enough to carve and round the bedrock, then return to finish the work. Some whisper about a different face. The body reads like a lion in repose, eroded and long. The head looks small for that mass, its features on many reconstructions drawn sharper than the body's wear would suggest. Supporters suggest the head was reworked later, that a face was recarved out of an older lion form when the dynasties needed a certain profile, a certain royal mark. Others dismiss the idea as wishful sketching over real stone. They remind you that heads scale oddly in monumental works, and that later restoration can alter proportions without rewriting the core date. If reworking happened, it becomes a layer, not a full origin story. Hold to what the stone itself says. The enclosure walls record a direction and a style of wear consistent with falling water and long intervals of wetness. The blocks around it, the causeways, the inscriptions higher up, speak in the language of kings and recorded projects from known periods. The two voices don't cancel each other, they argue across time. One names its maker, the other names a climate. The methods on both sides keep evolving. Surveys map the wall morphology in tighter grids, seeking patterns that would separate downfluting from side abrasion. Some teams study the cap and ledge layers to see how much was carved away by quarrying versus how much softened under weather. Others test salts and binders in the crust to pass whether the damage rose from damp air or groundwater cycles. A few bring in digital models to simulate rain sheets on the enclosure as it stands, then rotate the wind to match local data. Each new pass narrows the gap, but it doesn't close it fully. Even the order of work is debated. Did builders carve the figure out first, then cut the surrounding walls down, leaving them open to rain? Or did later efforts deepen the enclosure, exposing older surfaces to fresh weathering? Critics counter that if the walls were cut in stages, some channels may be younger than the core sculpture. Supporters suggest a long exposure under a wetter sky could carve both early and deep, with later hands renovating the temple floor and adding masonry that we now read as younger patches feathered into older bedrock. There's a quiet human truth in the maintenance. Someone stands here in each generation and mends a crack, resets a block, replasters a scar. Workers in the Old Kingdom left tool marks on the platform. Later dynasties set stelae and rebuilt small walls. Modern crews stabilise corners, seal fissures, and monitor salts. The monument is both relic and ongoing project. If the outline beneath is older, the caretaking above becomes a record of how different ages met the same stone. The climate part keeps tugging. If the wall's channels trace a wetter time, they fold the enclosure into a timeline that leans toward the early Holocene, when rains swept this latitude more often. That does not hand us a finished date or a single builder's name. It does set a mood. A plateau not yet baked, storms marching in from the west, water running down newly cut faces. When the sky shifted and the rains moved, the cutting would slow. Sand and salt would take over. The stone keeps both chapters, each with its own handwriting. The tension between inscription and erosion won't end tonight. Egyptology links the sculpture to a specific king by surrounding context and the style language they read with care. The geology leans toward a climate signature carved in the living rock. Taken together, they outline a layered life for the monument. One artist may have shaped the first form under a kinder sky. Another era may have fixed the head, restored the walls, and left names for us to see. If that blend is even partly true, it reshapes how we read the plateau. It suggests an origin that stretches past dynastic bounds, with later hands adapting, claiming, and preserving a form already ancient to them. The wall under your fingers doesn't argue, it only records. The channels run down to a floor paved by kings who came much later, and the meeting point feels like a hinge between climates. As dawn breaks clean over the desert, the breeze slides through the enclosure, carrying dust and the faint smell of stone warmed by a new day. You step back, and the grooves catch the light in small silver lines. They look like water still moving, even though the air is dry. Beyond the rim, a wider map waits. What if the same rains that carved here once fed rivers now hiding under sand? If those channels still lie beneath, they may point the way to stories older than any cartouche. The ground remembers more than we ask of it, so we follow the flow into the ghost rivers of the Sahara. A satellite swings over North Africa at night, and the screen glows in false colour. The dunes look smooth and endless at first, then lines begin to show through them, faint and blue, like veins under skin. They curve, braid, and end in ghostly fans that were once deltas. A technician in a dim lab nudges the contrast, and the channels sharpen into a map from a different climate. The room smells like warm plastic and printer ink. Fans murmur. Out in the image, the desert holds old water paths the way a fingerprint holds a life already lived. You hear the quiet click of a mouse, and a zoom pulls tight on a braid of channels cutting west to east, then bending toward the Atlantic shelf. This is one of the paleo rivers buried under sand, a track that some maps label as the Tamanrasset system. Another Pan and the Nile comes into view, and with it hints of ancient tributaries that once fed the long green ribbon. The paths do not show on the ground. They live in wavelengths we cannot see. The air in the lab is cool, but the thought is warm and heavy. Today's emptiness covers yesterday's roots. A hydrologist feeds a sheet into a big printer and watches the radargram crawl out band by band. The paper is stiff and smells faintly of toner. She traces a dark curve with her finger, right where the channel bends, then taps a spot that overlays a field of dunes on a satellite image. Out there is only wind, heat, and the long scrape of sand. On the paper, there is a river. A moment later, she writes a date range in the margin, a rough bracket for wetter centuries when these channels ran strong. Remote sensing opened this floorboard without digging. Shuttle radar, synthetic aperture systems, and elevation models stack into a patient picture. You read about lakes the size of small seas and channels wide enough to carry a flood season after season. The African humid period sits in that window, when monsoons reached farther north and the Sahara held wetlands and shorelines. Lake Megachad swelled and shrank like a slow breath, and these channels tied it all to basins and coasts. Stones that now heat under a noon sun may have sat in reed beds slick with spray. The map redraws how people could move. Water means routes, harvest, herds, places to meet. If you follow the channels edge to edge, you start to see corridors that cross the interior rather than skirting it. The old desert stories know these paths in another language. You catch them in rock carvings of fish, cattle, and boats, in places that now lie 100 miles from a river. The images could be art. They could also be memory, pressed into stone long after the water receded. The point is not a single proof, it's the chorus. A small mini-story lives in one panel of that map. A herder kneels at a shoreline that won't last, uses a flake of stone to carve a notch for the longest day, then a second for when the rains usually begin. Children skip flat rocks that hit and dance, leaving circles in the shallows. The lake laps at his ankles, muddy and warm. The mark he scratches is a calendar, so the herd moves with the seasons. 10,000 years roll by, and the shore walks away. The calendar remains, stranded, as if the water forgot its appointment. Critics counter that a channel on a radiogram is not a city. Watercourses can be intermittent, flashing and gone, braided with sand and dry for years at a stretch. They argue the flows may not have supported large permanent towns in the interior. Others suggest a different image: seasonal corridors, networks set by rain pulses rather than steady rivers, where groups gathered at nodes during wet windows and spread out during dry ones. Culture can grow in rhythms, not just grids. Markets do not need marble to count as cities of the mind. In the lab, the hydrologist clicks through time layers, overlays rainfall proxies, and aligns them with sediment cores that show shifts in grain size and pollen. The science is cautious. Dates carry ranges rather than single points. Channels do not print addresses. But the pattern takes on depth when different instruments agree. A line in the sand becomes a line on a screen, and a line in a core. You feel the weight of concordance building, even with the margins wide and the words careful. The Sahara's inland map starts to look like a spine with ribs. On one end, the wide track toward the ocean shelf where a mega delta once spread. On another, threads feeding the Nile during humid centuries. Between them, basins that pooled into lakes large enough to bend local climate, drawing birds, herds, and people. If you hike these areas today, your boots fill with sand and the sun presses the skin on your neck. The wind carries dust that tastes like chalk. But follow the radar and an old breeze returns, one that smelled of wet clay and cut grass. Supporters suggest that when waters pulled back, the roots did not vanish. They calcified. Trails became caravans, and landmarks that were once riverbends switched to dunes and inselbergs. Knowledge of when to move and where to camp survived as story. In that sense, memory travelled with the water's ghost, even as the ground dried. You can hear the echo of that idea in pastoral traditions across the Sahel and up into the oases that dot the north. Movement itself was the city, spread across weeks and miles. The technician runs a hand over the paper to smooth a curl, then pins it to a corkboard already crowded with overlapping sheets. A cluster of push pins marks suspected confluences. Neon thread traces hypothetical routes toward the northern basins. She writes a simple note: human corridors, with a question mark that leans slightly right. In that mark is a method. Don't declare. Ask fit one clue to the next. Keep the doubt honest and let the map breathe. Evidence of ancient lakes is not just a blue tint on a digital model. Shoreline ridges appear in relief data. Sediment fans spread in patterns that rivers make and dunes do not. Beach ridges curve like long, low smiles across the land. Farther south, the footprint of Mega Chad, at one time larger than some modern nations, shows in wave-cut benches and beds of silt where grass now grows thin. The sizes change with time, but even the low stands would have supported camps, fields, and boats. The desert wears these shapes like old scars. There's a practical piece hiding in the romance. Water carves not only channels but time. Wet phases open windows for travel and trade that can last centuries, then close. People respond by nesting knowledge in ritual and route. A song that lists oases in order, a carved mark that repeats a path to shelter, a pillar that frames sunrise when it's time to move. When the climate shifts hard, the songs outlive the road. They are portable maps, carried by families who no longer recall the lake, only that the fifth verse matters. Others dismiss the idea of sizable inland networks, pointing out the lack of large, obvious ruins. They note that what survives in the Sahara tends to be stone that sticks above sand, circles, mounds, and petroglyphs, rather than dense architecture. The rebuttal is simple, and also hard. If your world is mobile, you build light. If your wet season lasts part of the year, you leave little behind but hearths, pits, and scattered tool-making debris. The desert later takes even that, grindstone by grindstone. The absence reflects the life that made sense there. Not all channels are equal. Some carry long-term flow from uplands during humid phases. Others are flash routes, cutting and filling in months. The radar can suggest which is which by depth and continuity, but ground truthing seals it. Teams march into the heat, scoop, sieve, and record. They find old flood terraces and stack deposits where water once prowled. They also find nothing, a reminder that maps entice, and the land has veto power. Each empty trench clears false lines from the picture. One corner of the board holds a study that hints at a former branch near the lower Nile, a path that would have changed how floods spread and where settlements could latch on. The self-control here matters. No one draws a capital on it. The interest lies in the possibility that habitation zones shifted as channels waxed and waned, not in a single lost city. Think of belts that move north and south over centuries carrying seeds, fish and people. Where those belts paused, even for a lifetime, stories grew. A graduate student squints at overlapping contours and writes coordinates for the next survey. The grant money is tight, the field truck rattles, and the food tastes of dust. They do it anyway because the map keeps eating the desert the way tide pulls at a beach, revealing more each time. He jokes softly that cartographers of the future will need patience and sunscreen. Then he stops, because the joke holds too much truth. This work is slow and stubborn. It asks for years. The inland focus sharpens a way to read other puzzles. If the Sahara once held long threads of water, then routes west to east and south to north were not only possible but likely. Ideas move along the easiest path. A calendar stone in one basin may rhyme with a ring of posts in another. A carving of a cow with a star above it could be cargo carried by memory more than trade. In this frame, echoes across regions don't require ships, only time and an ankle-deep ford. Your eye drifts back to the first image on the screen. The desert as ochre, the channels as pale blue filigree. It is a quiet pattern, almost shy. It does not shout lost empires. It suggests seasons, gatherings, departures and returns. You can almost hear the slap of a paddle in shallow water and the lowing of cattle at dusk. Then the lab's air conditioner kicks on, and the scene pops back to a cool room and a humming monitor. It's a small shock, the way a dream fades when the fridge starts up at night. The payoff lands softly. The map of possible origins grows wider than the river you know. It stretches into basins that no longer glint and tracks that no longer flow, and it invites older timelines to run along them. Memory is a good traveller. It can outlast a lake, cross a dune field, and fold into a story held by a family 1,000 miles away. If there were builders who walked before the deserts hardened, their paths may be drawn here, faint as breath on glass. Beyond the lab, a day wind rises and presses sand into old hollows. Somewhere a line the radar found shifts by an inch, then smooths again. It is a reminder that the ground never stops moving, even when we think it sleeps. And if a climate can turn a sea into dust and tuck rivers under dunes, it can also wrench a world in the span of a few human lifetimes. The next chapter waits at the edge of that turn, where cold returned and shorelines broke apart. Along a low coastline you hear the sea working at old soil, pulling furrows into what used to be fields. Salt rides the air. The wind smells faintly of wet reeds and churned mud. In the moonlight, fence posts stick up from the surf like a row of worn teeth. The water laps at them with a patience that feels older than the map. A dog barks inland. The shore has slid back by miles, and no one standing here now would guess there was once a footpath where your shoes sink. That slow retreat is only one remnant of a larger lurch. The Younger Dryas sits like a hard knot in Earth's recent past, a cold snap that arrived quickly and ended sharply, roughly between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago by the radiocarbon clock. Temperatures in many regions dropped in a matter of decades. In the North Atlantic, the climate bucked and heaved. Ice sheets paused their melt, then resumed, then broke apart again. The timeline looks tidy on a graph. In the ground, it reads as chaos. The cause carries its own quarrel. One current points to meltwater rerouted into the Atlantic, freshening the surface and weakening the ocean, conveyor that moves heat north. Another points at volcanoes, ash veils that dim sunlight, and sulfur in the stratosphere. A third thread claims a more violent spark, an impact or airburst that lit the sky and shook the air. Each trigger leaves different fingerprints. Water changes salinity and currents. Volcanoes leave sulfate in polar ice. Impacts scatter tiny metallic spheres and melt glass across a broad reach. In a dim lab, a technician tilts a clear core tube under a strip of white light. Near the base, a thin, dark stripe catches the lamp. Under a scope, the layer holds charcoal flecks and round grains that shine like metal under a glare. The hand steadies. A note goes into a ledger. Depth, thickness, context. Those small circles might be spherules, the kind formed in fast, hot bursts, or they might have a more ordinary origin, ground down from basalt and carried by wind. The data doesn't shout, it sits there and asks for careful reading. Most researchers agree on the shape of the event, if not the spark. The cooling was abrupt. It lasted about 12 centuries. It ended as quickly as it began. In Greenland's ice, you can trace the shift in oxygen isotopes, a proxy for temperature, like a steep stair. In lake beds, the switch appears as a change in pollen, cold-loving plants pushing out others, then losing ground when warmth returns. Big animals vanish across continents during and after this window. The picture is patchy, but the pattern holds. A fast, cold plunge, a long chill, then a sharp rebound. The contested impact idea sits in the corner like an uninvited guest who won't leave, in part because parts of the world do show those dark layers with odd debris. Some teams report melt glass, nanodiamonds and magnetic grains dated near the onset of the cooling. Others repeat the tests and find ordinary soot, no special carbon structures, and spheres that fit industrial contamination or normal geology. Critics counter that the extraordinary needs stronger proof, tighter dating, and consistent signatures across many sites. Supporters suggest the scatter fits an airburst, not a cratered strike, and that the weaker signal would fade first in wet ground. The numbers around sea level add another wrinkle. While the Younger Dryas itself was cold, the long trend outside it was rising water. As ice sheets wasted away, the ocean climbed more than 100 metres from the glacial low to where it sits today. Some steps came gently, others jumped in pulses when ice dams failed and bays filled. After the cold snapped off around 11,700 years ago, warmth surged and the climb resumed. Deltas drowned. Continental shelves that once held river mouths and shallow villages went under. Shorelines went walkabout. A boat builder in a muddy delta keeps working while the river rewrites itself. He oils a cedar plank and watches the channel he learned as a child widen each spring. 10 years. 20. The far bank loses a line of trees, then a field, then a path. One season, a storm cuts a new mouth, and the old one silts in. He moves his shed 2 times. He marks the high water on a post. One day he begs a ride to a ridge because the tide now reaches the door. If you told him the sea rose a few centimetres each year, he would just squint and point at the place where his cousin's house used to stand. For archaeologists, that flood of blue over low ground is both a thief and a hint. Coastal peoples like coasts. Food is reliable there, trade is easier. But most of those early edges lie underwater now. Sonar picks out old riverbeds crossing the floor. Sandbars hide what might be worked stone or might be reefs. In a few places, divers find timbers and artifacts near submerged caves and cliffs. Elsewhere, trawl nets pull up pottery from a bank that used to be a terrace. The ocean keeps most of it quiet. Volcanoes remain in the story too. Ice cores hold clear layers of sulfur from known blasts. But matching a specific eruption to the trigger moment proves hard. The timing must be exact. The scale must be global. The ash ought to show broad reach. Some records hint at candidates in Alaska or Iceland. Others say the sulfur peaks cluster but do not align neatly with the first plunge into cold. Meltwater routing still leads in many textbooks because it ties into the physics of ocean heat, and the path makes sense with the retreating ice sheets and broken lakes that ringed North America. Out in the open tundra of that age, human groups would have watched animals shift their routes, lakes freeze late and thaw late, and storms swing out of place. A family might leave a valley that winter and never return because the fish no longer run there. Fires become necessary longer in the year. Food storage gets tricky. Oral maps adjust. Children learn new seasons and old ones turn into stories. The changes are not million-year slow. They bite within a span a living person can feel. A museum case holds a reassembled caribou antler with a notch pattern. The caption says it marked moons. The count stops abruptly near the end of one line. That could be coincidence. Or it might be the season a group left a lake that failed. The record falls silent where wood rotted and hides decayed. Stone keeps the sturdier entries. We learn from what endures, and the medium edits the message. The Younger Dryas ended in a flash of warmth. In the Greenland cores, it is a cliff up, not a slope. Glacier fronts fell back, forests returned, people adapted again, shorelines turned into strangers. In river basins, new deltas formed further inland while the outer reaches met the sea. If there were libraries on early coasts, not buildings with shelves, but places where knowledge gathered in tools, carvings and meeting grounds, many would now lie beyond the surf line. Some whisper that this erase and restart cycle could hide a trial run of complexity, a set of skills passed hand to hand and then broken up by flood and frost. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking, noting that known sites show slow growth, not a sudden fall from heights we cannot find. The sober middle says that climate can turn progress into a zigzag, not a smooth climb. It asks us to look where we rarely dig, under bays, along drowned plains beneath river mouths, and to accept that land we depend on today was once a different world. A small field team stands on a cliff that used to be inland. The rock under their boots shows old beach ripples in stone. A mile out, whitecaps mark a bar that was once a dune. The leader circles a date on a clipboard and draws a line to the present. He doesn't make a speech. He just breathes the cool air and listens to the low, steady roar. You can't hear a civilization vanish. You can only hear the water that follows. The global jolt we call the Younger Dryas is useful because it proves a principle. Change does not always creep. Sometimes it jumps. When it jumps, people improvise. They move. They save what they can carry. They teach what they can hold in memory. They leave heavy things behind when time runs out. Even when the cold eases, the sea continues to climb, and the places where memory lived go out of reach. A beach can become a channel can become a shelf floor. On a calm evening, sonar scans paint a faint fan where a river once met the ocean. It looks like a ghost delta. The boat rocks gently, and a researcher grips the rail, eyes on a screen. A pattern appears that could be stones shaped into a line, or just a trick of waves and silt. There's no triumph in that moment, only patience. The work takes seasons. The weather waits for no one. The tide rolls over the same ground again and again. The story here is mechanism and erasure, colder air, shifted currents, dust in the sky, fires that sweep across dry grasslands, waves that carry topsoil away grain by grain. Over 12 centuries, then in a snap of warmth, the board resets. What survives? Bone in caves, tools in dry shelters, carvings in hard rock. If you built in wood on a shelf that now lies 60 meters down, you're an absence on the map. If you build in stone, you still have a chance to be heard. So when someone points to an old block and says it speaks of lost hands, the safer reply is to ask how old coastlines moved and where those hands might have stood. Drowned edges, buried deltas, and frost-slashed hills all play their part in what we cannot find today. The Younger Dryas doesn't need to prove myths to remind us that time edits. It only needs to show how a climate spasm can thin a library down to what water and wind cannot take. And if some stones did remain, holding sharp corners and tight faces through millennia of weather, the next question moves from where to how. Not who, not yet, just the craft itself. The touch, the cut, the clean seam in hard rock that still looks fresh when the light skims across it. How were they worked to such tight tolerances, and what would it take to do that again in the dim of ancient light? In a museum drawer that smells faintly of dust and wax, a granite cylinder rests on black foam. It's short and heavy for its size, with a spiral groove winding along its skin like the thread on an old bolt. The clerk turns on a single lamp. Light runs across the core's edge and catches in the helical valley. Bright on one side, shadow on the other. On the tag, a neat hand lists a provenience. Old Kingdom debris field near a pyramid quarry collected during earlier surveys. The label is quiet. The stone is not. It brings its own questions to the surface. Early surveyors noted spiral striations like this on several cores recovered in Egypt, and the shape sticks in the mind. If you take a hollow tube, press it down into granite with abrasive grit, and rotate, you can indeed cut a core. That's the textbook. The twist comes with irregular spacing on some examples. The groove steps in a sequence that seems to track a steady push while turning, a pattern machinists read as feed per revolution. Supporters suggest that regularity hints at guided motion more than hand pressure. Critics counter that patient work with a stiff jig and practiced hands can average out the wobble. You can almost hear both camps breathing over the same stone. A machinist invited to consult on the collection slips on nitrile gloves and bends close. He sets a small scale along the core, then traces the helical groove with a fingertip, counting under his breath. He marks 2 points with a soft pencil, checks the spacing again, and smiles in a tired way only shop people do. The number is not a revelation. It's a clue that sits quietly beside others. He notes where the groove tightens and where it loosens, the way the cut deepens at one turn and fades at the next. Human work often carries that faint drift, like handwriting on a bus. Older notes from field measurement record diameters of copper tube drills found on sites, and the silica content of the grit used as the actual cutter. In modern replications, copper tubes charged with quartz sand eat into granite slowly, throwing up a slurry that smells like wet coins and riverbed. The resulting cores show spiral bands, but the spacing tends to wander, and the groove walls look torn in places. When pressure and rotation are kept steady with a simple frame, the surface tidies up and the pattern evens out. Neither side claims victory there. The experiments show what's possible. The artifacts show what someone did. The debate sharpens when you scale up from a core to a saw cut. At several sites, exposed granite shows wide kerfs that look like they came from an oversized blade or a thick wire saw packed with grit. Lines run parallel, a few millimeters apart, as if the tool walked slightly while biting. A visitor who has cut stone for a living can't help but lean in and set a straight edge. The contact points are few, but they're crisp. Under raking light, the striations carry the same cadence you find on a lapped surface, a faint rhythm that repeats with a ghostly regularity. Some whisper that this implies a systematic toolpath. Others dismiss it as the natural outcome of rubbing two hard surfaces together for a very long time. You meet a conservator down in a cool storage room where the air feels damp despite the desert outside. She pulls a flat offcut from a tray and tips it toward the light. The sheen is subtle, not a mirror, but the plane holds a line well. She talks about lapping plates, flat blocks charged with abrasive, used to bring other surfaces to flatness by rubbing in figure-8 patterns. Woodworkers and lens makers do this today. Could the same principle, scaled in stone with hard, fine grit, explain the finish inside a granite box or on a sarcophagus lid? She thinks it can, if you accept long timelines and a cultural patience we sometimes underestimate. The machinist returns to the core and points out a tiny ridge where the groove steps in tighter for a turn. Variable hand pressure could do that. He also notes a faint scratch running perpendicular to the spiral, perhaps from a small grain wedged in the tube wall. Marks like these can tell you about the dance between tool and material. The copper is softer than the stone. The sand is the real cutter. If the feed rate, the push per turn, stays roughly constant, a spiral emerges. Keep it steady enough and you get lines so even that a shop foreman would nod. Let it drift and the pattern breathes like a human chest. Supporters suggest that some cores seem to go beyond steady enough. They point to sections where the pitch remains nearly uniform over several turns, and the groove depth stays consistent, which can imply a rigid setup. Critics counter with the power of muscle memory and the stabilizing effect of slurry. As grit loads the kerf, the system damps vibration and the cut self-regulates. They also warn about reading too much from surfaces battered by time, cleaning and handling. A few microns lost to erosion or a scuff can shift a measurement just enough to flatter a theory. There's a related thread in the field reports, saw marks on granite showing intervals that some readers treat as tooth spacing. Granite is hard to fool. If you drag a toothed blade across it with grit, the peaks leave a chatter that repeats. But a woven wire charged with sand will write a different signature, more like a smoothed wave. Without the blade in hand, interpretation leans on inference. A stoneworker drags a finger along the line and tries to feel the cadence. A geologist reaches for a hand lens and looks for rounded microfractures that speak of abrasion rather than tooth impact. Two lenses, two instincts. From there, the conversation often falls into power. Was the rotation human, with bow drills and weighted ropes, or was there some other aid? The rivers nearby could drive a simple spindle, but evidence for such rigs is thin. You can rotate a tube by hand with a bowstring and a pivot block. You can add a heavy stone to press down. You can even create a simple frame that limits wobble. Supporters suggest the regular grooves reflect such guidance to a high standard. Critics counter that well-practiced crews working in teams were the guidance, and that time plus technique narrows the gap between handmade and machine-made, more than we assume. A small oddity sits in another tray, a granite fragment with a groove that stops dead, as if the tool jumped, or the cut was interrupted mid-motion. The break surface is crisp. The striation edges are sharp at the stop line. A curator notes that this pause could reflect a cracked tool, a jam, or a decision to shift the approach. If you've ever run a file into a corner and felt it bite, you know the feeling. The fragment reads like a fossil of a workday. Some reports also describe faint polishing on the interior of vessel necks, where a tapered tool would have trouble reaching if the method was purely abrasive slurry on a flat face. Here, the idea of shaped laps appears, a plug of hard stone or wood, wrapped or charged with fine grit, rotated and worked to burnish the surface. When done well, the inner bore gleams in a low light, not as a mirror, but as a controlled mat that keeps a straight line without wavering. That finish shows up in more than one site, and it ties back to the broader question of how a toolkit without iron shaped a material that eats steel blades for breakfast. The core in the drawer, the saw-cut slab, the polished bore, each is a micro scene. You can place them side by side with blocks that mate so closely the seam vanishes at arm's length. The micro-evidence talks about controlled motion and stubborn grit. The macro-evidence talks about flatness and right angles on a scale that makes your neck hurt. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. If small marks speak of a steady hand and guided movement, then walls that meet true might be the same language written in larger letters. All this leans on time. There's a practical limit to how fast copper and sand can eat granite. It's slow, it's also cumulative. A team working in shifts can turn a tube all day with a rhythm that settles into the body, and wet slurry carries away the dust that would choke the cut. Some whisper that the regular feed seen on a few cores implies a motive aid. Others dismiss the need for anything beyond labour, fixtures, and knowledge passed down like a family song. The truth perhaps sits in the margin where tools and discipline meet. A field notebook, stained at the edges, records a simple observation at dawn. Saw grooves grow clearer under low-angled light. The worker who wrote it ripped a flap from a paper sack and slid it under his page to keep the graphite from smearing. That small act feels right in this maze of stone puzzles. Little procedures add up. Press here, not there. Turn and lift, then reset. Change grit when the sound dulls. These are the kinds of rules that build finish into a shop or into a quarry. When the machinist packs up, he takes one last measurement of the spiral pitch and writes it down twice, once in inches and once in millimetres. He knows that later someone will argue the number, and he wants the conversion to be clean. Numbers don't prove intent. They set boundaries on what must be explained. If the groove steps wrap around the core with an average feed per turn that's tight, then any story about how it was made needs to account for that steadiness, not just the fact that the stone was cut. Critics counter that many of these artefacts were found out of their original working context, tumbled, reused, or knocked from dumps after centuries of weather. That complicates the chain of custody and the reading of marks. Supporters suggest that even a weathered signature can carry the essential rhythm of the process intact. Either way, the draw holds weight. The core is real. The spiral is not a rumour. It's right there, rough under a glove. You leave the room with a mild grit taste on your tongue, the way granite dust lingers in the air even after it settles. The small marks don't shout, but they don't fade either. They connect to the larger questions that run through the plateau. If a tube and sand can write such even spirals, then a casing joint that accepts no blade of light feels less like a miracle and more like a scaled version of the same stubborn method. If, on the other hand, the pattern suggests a guiding system we haven't fully accounted for, then the tight seams start to look like a symptom of a broader disciplined craft. The artifacts exist. That's the steady ground. The argument now thins to three pillars: how the tool was pushed, how the rotation was kept faithful, and how long the crew stayed at it. Power, guidance, and time. Each can carry more weight than we think when stacked well. Each can fail in the telling if leaned on too hard. The night outside is cool as you step from the archive into the corridor, and the mind drifts to a different stage of the same puzzle. When the piece is cut and polished, how do you move 100 tons with grace? Heat ripples off the quarry floor at Aswan. The granite bites through your soles even in thick shoes, and the air shivers with cicadas and far-off barge engines on the Nile. In the cut bedrock, the unfinished obelisk lies tethered to the earth, a monolith longer than a city bus, one end cracked, the other still fused to the mother stone. Dust in the shade tastes metallic, and the face of the obelisk warms like a stove as the morning slides toward noon. A mason presses his palm to the rough flank, counting small dimples where dolerite pounders struck. The rhythm is long gone, but the marks hold the beat. Here, the puzzle isn't charming, it's heavy. Multi-ton blocks had to travel from this heat to the Giza Plateau, or to Sahara, or beyond, across a landscape that shifts with the river's moods. They had to be lifted without chipping edges and set so tight that a blade skims and catches. Each stone asks a practical question in the same even voice. How do you move weight without losing control of the line? A foreman from a local crew keeps a weathered notebook tucked into his back pocket. When he flips it open, the pencil drawing is simple and clean. A long sled, a block lashed with cross ropes, men in two teams leaning into the pool. Two figures pour water along the path. A wide rope curves from the sled's front, and even on paper you can almost hear it creak. He taps the edge of the sketch and shrugs. Things move if you give them a path and enough hands. The path, though, is the hard part. Ramps take space. A straight ramp tall enough for the Great Pyramid demands prodigious fill if you keep a gentle slope. Spiral designs wind around the core and need careful anchoring. A zigzag could nest into the pyramid's sides but consumes labour with every change of angle. None feels neat when you map the volumes. You can do it, but the sand piles high in your mind, and the timetable stretches until the sun sinks again. The water trick isn't folklore. Teams have shown that dampening sand changes its behaviour. It locks grains together just enough to keep a sled from digging a trench. Dry, the runners fight the dunes and bog down. Saturated, the sled ploughs a bow wave and stalls. Slightly wet, it slides with manageable drag. A technician points to a curve on a clipboard, the line bending as moisture rises, and says quietly that the sweet spot is real. You don't need myths to lower friction. You need a bucket and a sense for soil. Ropes leave traces in the body. Picture shoulders rubbed raw, palms calloused, timing learned by breath and chant. A rope captain nods, then gives a short pull to set cadence. The block shifts as one, no jerks, no lurches. It's mundane skill, not mystery. But when you follow that sled out of the quarry and down to a waiting barge, scale taps your shoulder again. If the block weighs as much as a truck fleet, the boat must rise to meet it. Currents must be read like text. Landings must have firm footing and space enough to turn. High Nile flood becomes a tool. Inundation lifts boats closer to the valley's edge, so a short causeway does the final handoff. The river slackens at eddies and curves. Men with poles feel the flow through the wood. The hull telegraphs every bump. A watcher on the bank lifts a hand and paces the boat in the reeds. Calling depth changes the way a friend warns you at a curb. The landing is compacted with rubble and planks. It doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like patience that learned the temperament of water, then bent to it. At Giza, the long causeway climbing from the river plain hints at how state power liked a straight line when it could afford one. The base shows rougher stone, then steadier courses as it climbs. You can follow tool marks up, and up again, until the present breaks the chain. Wind sandpapers the old skin. A child drops a bottle cap into a crack and laughs at the small clink. Time keeps adding its own layers on top of whatever the builders meant. Critics keep the case spare. They say mud brick ramps, levers, rollers, and enough people can do this work. There's time, there's incentive, and there's the state's ability to feed, tax, and punish. They point to experiments where teams pull heavy loads on wet sand. They point to quarries at Tura and Aswan, roads worn slick by sled runners, and graffiti that records gangs by name. The story is labour with supervision, and simple tools used with discipline. Supporters of a harder problem slow everything down and ask about the last few inches. They bend to a casing joint fragment and lay a steel rule along it, and the light slips evenly on both sides. The fit is impressive beyond the normal play of rubble walls. They touch seating surfaces inside a mastaba and trace the evenness with the back of a fingernail. They concede a ramp can deliver a block to a level. They ask how you land it at the final height, in growing wind, into an opening barely wider than the stone itself, with no twist when rope and men breathe. A small group gathers around a wooden model on a table near the quarry office. Levers click as a carpenter leans his weight, showing how a stone can be inched up without a crane. With wedges and alternating fulcrums, the block rises one breath at a time. The carpenter's arms barely tremble, the block climbs, wedges move, the timber squeaks, the lift holds. The sequence isn't graceful, but it works. From the quarry to the site, roadbeds had to bear more than a single pass. Old causeway fragments still show smoothness where many sleds ground down the stone. Cart ruts elsewhere in the country sink inches into bedrock. Proof that years of weight will carve a geology you can measure. The idea that men pulled and guided isn't romantic. It's right there, etched by repetition. You can slide a fingertip along a rut and follow the past like a groove on vinyl. Boats carry their own story. In museum halls, ship timbers from royal pits sit in the glow of white light, restored and stretched to full length. Seam joints are tight. Planks are locked with mortise and tenon pegs that resist twist. A boatwright talks about flex and surge and how a long hull handles a river that acts like a living thing. He taps a plank with his knuckle. It answers in a dull note and a tiny buzz in bone. The river runs a schedule: flood, pause, drop. Moving stone in sync with that rise and fall isn't just smart, it's survival. A foreman stares at a flood mark on a quay wall and reads years of water like an almanac. He knows when to risk the big loads and when to keep them tied tight. He doesn't use a calendar. He speaks to the river with small tests and short moves until he trusts it to carry. If you insist on one great ramp, you need a mine's worth of fill. If you spread the effort into many smaller workarounds, you trade volume for complexity. Perhaps they built ramps that were partly embedded in the rising courses, then cut them away as the skin closed. Perhaps they used reversible cribbing and timbers at the core, scaling the lift as they rose, then cleared the scaffolding through internal passages as they closed the top. The evidence is thin because builders cleared waste as they finished. That habit makes clean monuments and messy theories. On the ground, the physics is friendly if you respect limits. Friction can be lowered with water. Mass can be leveraged if you accept time. The human body can move more than it seems built for when a team locks step and breath. That much is boring and true. The strange part starts when the block meets a seat cut so flat that the joint disappears under daylight. Walk the quarry ledges and you'll see where ambition snapped. The unfinished obelisk cracked near its foot, likely from heat or a hidden flaw in the stone. One decision saved enormous effort. Better to fail at the source than lose a month on the river. That choice tells you something about planning. It tells you they tested stress, read rock, and accepted loss early rather than late. Follow the ancient road north in your mind and you can dot the journey with food depots, tool caches and rest shelters for teams. Someone sharpened chisels at dawn. Someone boiled barley and onions and poured beer into jars with reed plugs. Someone kept tally on sherds and scraps of limestone with quick marks and simple math. Movement wasn't only a mechanical problem, it was logistics in bread and rope and shade. When the block arrived at the pyramid's edge and climbed to its tier, a new phase began. Fine control came to the front. Wooden shims and small wedges helped settle the stone. Excess mortar, if used, filled microvoids and squeezed out like a thin ribbon. Then a mallet's soft blows coaxed the last millimetres as crews watched the joint line for evenness. A veteran ran a reed along the seam, feeling for catches. If the reed snagged, he signalled. If it glided, they eased the ropes and stepped back. A skeptic smiles at mystery and points, again, to time. Give thousands of workers decades, and tolerances can arrive by attrition. The skeptical smile fades a little, though, when a quarryman lines up a straight edge on a granite box far from Giza and the light barely peeks under. The work repeats in places not tied to royal vanity projects. That repetition suggests a culture of exact work, not a one-off flourish. Supporters pull the lens back further. They suggest the old crews knew tricks that we've lost, small and cumulative techniques that never made it into text. Knowledge can vanish when it moves through hands, not through books. Watch a modern stone yard for a day and you'll see gestures you won't find in a manual. 2 fingers under a block's edge to read stress. A hush before a lift while everyone resets in their head. A shout that means only one thing to that crew and nonsense to anyone else. We've avoided motors and interiors and power because the skin of the job is hard enough to study on its own. The strange, tight fit at the end reframes the ramp debate. You can move mountains slowly. The arrival still grips the breath. The heavy piece doesn't just land. It settles into place as if it was meant to live there, and then the next one moves. Out at Aswan, the noon heat finally breaks a little. A gust comes off the water. A boatman whistles and knots a line without looking at his hands. A boy tosses a bucket, and a fan of droplets lands dark on pale sand. The trail slick and ready. The sled will move. It will grind. It will answer the pull with a grudging slide. The physics say yes to many methods, and the stones confirm the force. The question left on the ground is small and sharp. Who taught the last inch to behave? The foreman folds his sketch and tucks it away. He glances once more at the broken obelisk and then toward the river. Night will cool the quarry, and tomorrow the same problems will rise with the sun. Downstream, a chamber waits where sound becomes a tool in its own right, and stone begins to sing. Inside the king's chamber, the air feels cool against your cheeks, dry and faintly mineral, like the breath of a cave. A technician eases a fibre optic line along the seam of 2 granite blocks, and the light blooms in a narrow strand, tracing mica flecks that sparkle and vanish as the angle shifts. Someone hums a single tone, steady and low. The note swells and hangs. The walls push it back in clean waves, as if the stone prefers that pitch and leans toward it. Your chest carries the vibration. It is gentle, but there is weight to it. A second voice joins, and the sound thickens into a slow-moving pattern that seems to stand still, then lurch a half step across the room. You can feel places where the tone grows louder by a hand's width, and places where it dims. The sarcophagus accepts a knuckle tap with a clear ring. A tuner app on a phone flashes between A and a hair above. The technician smiles without speaking, and the light cable throws a thin line across the lid, catching a ripple in the polish where tools once kissed the surface. The hush after the note falls carries a faint after ring, soft as breath on cold glass. Here's what is documented. The chamber favours particular frequencies. Standing waves develop, patterns of sound that park in space, rising and falling when the note slips into their lane. That behaviour repeats across visits and voices, not just with one singer or one device. Granite is the main ingredient here, cut into blocks and pinned tight, and granite holds quartz. Quartz responds to stress with a small electrical stir. That property, piezoelectricity, is simple lab physics. Strike the right tone, and you vibrate the stone, and tiny charges appear. The debate curls around intent. Some argue these effects belong to physics alone. Build any hard, rectangular room of this size, and you will find a tone that shakes it awake. Others suggest the proportions and materials did not land here by accident. They point to a stack of dimensions that read like someone walked a ruler past the note until the room agreed. The rows of ceiling beams behave like tuning elements. The sarcophagus adds another voice. It could be coincidence. You could be careful. A physicist crouches in the corner and runs a sweep on a small speaker, moving through pitches and steps. He carries a notepad with a hand-drawn grid of the floor. As the tone drifts, he marks where the sound swells, then fades. A pattern emerges like a checkerboard in slow motion. When he taps the sarcophagus edge with a padded mallet, it answers with a tone near D-sharp, a close partner to the room's favourite A. A perfect fifth, he says under his breath, almost amused, is not proof of design. It is, however, a tidy fit between 2 stone voices. In the 1990s, a sound engineer carried test gear into these rooms and wrote about the way certain frequencies seemed to concentrate, as if the geometry nudged them into shapes. His notes were not claims of ancient power plants. They were careful measurements and observations, peaks and dips, harmonics that lit up at predictable points on the map of the chamber. That work continued in informal fits, from field recorders tucked behind blocks to tone generators set on the sarcophagus floor. The story that grows from this data is modest and testable. Within these shapes, sound behaves in certain ways and repeats those behaviours. Beyond Giza, old stone spaces answer to specific tones as well. In a passage grave on a rainy coast, a low chant can cause the air to tremble, and whispering galleries carry voice from corner to corner with no effort. Deep in an island hypogeum, a single note thickens until visitors describe a buzzing in the skull. These are not match and claim comparisons. They are gentle echoes that suggest people once listened as they built, then built to what they heard. It may be simple. When you live by hand and eye, the feedback of sound is a tool. A small story travels with the masons. a worker on a quarry face notices that a tap on granite rings longer when the grain is tight and the surface is true. Over time, he learns to strike in rhythm, to feel the beat that keeps his hands steady, to avoid fractures that would waste a week of labour. Apprentices pick up the habit. The crew hums to pass the hours. They discover that certain corners carry the voice back in a pleasant way. Work shifts there when the sun is harsh. Later, a foreman looks for those spots when aligning a chamber, noticing how the sound settles and holds. That is not magic. It is craft that listens. In galleries under Sahara, the effect plays out on a different stage. Low, long tunnels amplify voice in pockets, and the corbelled ceilings of a red pyramid take in sound and toss it back with a faint shimmer. Visitors sometimes step out with a hand to the wall, saying they feel lightheaded or off balance. That sensation fits a known effect. Standing waves can fool the inner ear, the same way a car with windows cracked an inch can set up an uncomfortable thrum. None of this demands exotic science. It rests on our basic wiring and the way stone rooms shape air. From there, some whisper that the choice of granite in key volumes was not only about strength. Quartz-rich stone sings and responds. If intention lurked behind material selection, it could have been symbolic, ritual, or practical. Vibrations can help settle joints or make faults visible. They can focus attention in ceremony or prayer. In a lab, quartz produces a measurable charge when squeezed or vibrated, so a thought arrives softly. If the chamber took in sound, then pushed stress through its crystalline lattice, could tiny currents have mattered to anyone here? Not as fuel for lamps perhaps, but as a felt effect, a tingle, a sign. A recent wave of modelling work, not on acoustics, but on electromagnetic behaviour, showed how the pyramid shape can host resonances at radio wavelengths under certain conditions. It does not prove ancient engineers chased radio. It does hint that large stone volumes can trap energy in ways our formulas can predict. Sound and radio are different animals, yet both produce patterns in enclosed shapes. The rhyme is simple. Geometry matters. When you stack precision upon mass, you create spaces that interact with fields and waves without a single wire or pane of glass. Skeptics counter that even if the chamber sits at a tidy pitch, the number means little. A equals 440 cycles per second because modern musicians agreed to it after many debates. They also note that human ears love patterns and will find them. If you hum long enough in any echoing room, you will stumble into a resonance. Supporters suggest that agreement on a pitch today does not erase the physics behind a good fit yesterday. A room can favour that tone whether you name it or not. Both views fit inside the evidence. The argument repeats at a low volume, like a sound check before a show. Take the sarcophagus again. It is slightly too large to exit through the corridors as they stand, which hints that builders set it in place as the chamber rose around it. Its interior rings when struck, and its walls show a finish that catches light in a clean band. That shape is not a violin, but it behaves as a resonator in a basic sense. Place a tone within it, and you receive colour and sustain. The relationship between its ring and the chamber's hum could be incidental. It could also be a simple way to create a stable beat for ritual or measurement. Two fixed notes making a constant interval, free of the drift of the human voice. Not all rooms here respond the same way. Lower chambers choke the voice and turn it muddy. Narrow passages kill long tones and break them into echoes. This unevenness argues against a single overarching acoustic plan and toward pockets of effect. It is a point for those who see coincidence layered on craft, not an ancient laboratory. Yet even pockets can be useful. A priest, a foreman, or a surveyor can learn where to stand to be heard or to hear themselves. The memory of those spots could outlast the reason they were chosen. On a night tour, a guard rests his back on a granite block and hums a scale under his breath. He stops when one note flares in his chest. He learned the trick from his uncle, who learned it from a restorer. No great meaning follows. It's a quiet game played in a stone room. Still he smiles and shows a guest where the sound stands still near the wall. The visitor presses a palm to the block and feels the faintest tremble slide through bone. In that simple exchange, a habit of listening crosses time without drama or claim. Pieces of this appear in other cultures. A tomb in a damp valley aligns with the winter sun, and on that day a single drum at the entrance fills the passage with a steady beat. A sea cave carved by hand answers a chant with a low rumble like distant thunder. People who live with stone learn its moods. They may build toward warmth, toward water, or toward a sound that helps a moment feel larger than a room. The thread is human, not heroic. It ties practicality to awe with a small knot. Bring it back to quartz for a last note. Laboratory benches make it easy to show that a crystal plate hums with electricity when shaken. Scale that up to thousands of tons, and the numbers remain tiny. Yet tiny does not mean irrelevant in ritual settings. A tingling palm, a hair lifted by static in dry air, a flicker at the edge of a flame can sell meaning more than any sermon. If stone could help stage that feeling by holding a note steady and feeding back a whisper of energy, then the choice of materials becomes another kind of tool. So whether the chamber is a happy accident of hard rectangles or a deliberate instrument, it behaves like an instrument. The note is there for any voice to find. The walls answer back in a way we can measure and map with gear no more exotic than a microphone and a sweep tone. Modern modelling can help us predict it, but even without computation, a careful ear will do. The room itself teaches its song, and as the last hum fades and the technician reels in the light, the thin beam glides over joints you could barely slip a card into, then onto the doorway, where the air of the corridor moves with a faint draft. Somewhere beyond these walls, other stones keep other notes. The next step takes us out across oceans, where different hands shape blocks that seem to rhyme in their own quiet keys. A cold wind crosses the altiplano and picks at your collar as you stand among broken platforms near Tiwanaku. The air is thin and dry. Each breath feels like it's been sanded clean. At Pumapunku, massive slabs sit at angles that look accidental until your fingertips find edges that run straight like a tool mark. The ground gives a little under your boots, a cushion of dust over old foundations. In the distance, the lake flashes a dull slate colour. The blocks don't shout. They wait, their faces clipped and crisp, as if unfinished puzzles lost their last page of instructions. A local guide steps beside you and runs a palm along a dovetail notch. His hand slows at a corner no wider than a fingernail, and you can hear his breath across the stone. It feels cut, not chipped. You watch him tilt his wrist so the skin rides the angle without breaking contact. It's a small motion with a lot packed into it. He points to an H-shaped block, then to a line of sockets that seem designed to hold clamps or tie stones in a lateral grip. The pattern shows a habit of thinking in keys and locks rather than piles and wedges. Let the frame widen. In Lebanon, Baalbek sleeps under a hill town where swallows spin above honeyed columns and a wind carries bakery smoke. At the edge of that temple platform sit colossal stones, part of a trillathon, each one heavier than nearly anything moved in antiquity by standard accounts. The surfaces carry tooling streaks and shallow bosses, little raised pads left to be shaved off last. Down in the Mediterranean, Malta's temples curve in thick walls that hold summer heat, their entrances lining with certain sunrises and sunsets. The alleys between stones smell faintly of dust and sea salt, and the joints keep weather out in ways that feel rehearsed. Supporters suggest these echoes are more than coincidence. Oversized blocks, tight joins, and alignments tuned to the sky. Critics counter that cherry-picking creates a melody out of notes that don't belong to the same song. The caution is fair. If you roam long enough, patterns appear. Still, the shape of the questions changes when your hand meets an edge, and it refuses to waver under the straight side of a modern ruler. The pattern doesn't prove anything. It lingers like a tune you can't place, threaded through different languages. Keep to conservative ground for a moment. Tiwanaku and its monumental neighbours reached their cultural height in the 1st millennium CE, within the Andean highlands at altitudes that force careful planning for water, crops, and movement. Much of the large stonework anchors that era, though some foundations and terraces likely layer older phases beneath. Baalbek's Roman temples date to the early centuries CE, yet parts of the deep platform below show techniques that cause debate. How older are the base courses, and which period stacked which tiers? On Malta, the major temple complexes fall around the 4th to 3rd millennium BCE. Their walls and curved plans belong to islanders who shaped coralline and Globigerina limestone with care, leaving doorways that frame specific light. Precision appears in different flavours. At Pumapunku, certain cuts form right angles and slots, as though guided by a template, though the blocks also show rougher faces where work stopped or changed. At Baalbek, the scale wins the argument before any micrometer arrives. The way the biggest stones sit in a line invites questions about lifting methods and base preparation. Malta's strength lies in orientation and repeated formal elements. The same curves, the same threshold stones, the same sight lines to the sun's edges at key times of year. Each site shows a priority: joints, mass, or light. You kneel at a corner and trace a hairline seam that pushes back against your nail. The stone feels cool. A thin ant moves across the gap and vanishes into shadow. That little insect becomes a reminder that the smallest spaces anchor big stories. In each place, the difference between stacked stones and interlocked modules lives in seams you can barely see. It's there the mind of the builder pokes through. Astronomical orientations surface here too, though they need quiet handling. Malta's doorways catch solstice light in ways that feel deliberate. Some Andean sites mark lunar extremes or frame solar pillars on nearby ridges. People lived by seasons and needed regular sky markers. At Tiwanaku, certain sightlines suggest a watch on the sun's yearly walk. Chance can produce alignments, and statistics are tricky when many lines can be drawn. The careful move is to note recurring orientation to cardinal points or key risings, then ask if ritual or calendar needs could have guided the plan. Parallel invention or shared memory sits at the heart of this. A mason shaping a block in the Andes would solve different problems than a team lifting at Baalbek, yet both end up with solutions that feel similar in spirit: oversized elements, broad faces, couplings that resist shear, and sills that lock direction. Independent groups under stress, thin air, seismic risk, or imperial messaging often converge on robust design. Others whisper that echoes carry across oceans through long migration arcs or slow trade of ideas. Boats have always been better at moving stories than we think. The truth sits between tides and timelines, fuzzy at the edges. There's a practice that threads these places, flattening, checking, and rehabbing. You can hear it in the scratch of an abrasive plate dragged in circles, in the hollow ring when a block taps seat and tells the crew it's home. One crew pushes for crisp external faces, another cares for the hidden keys and tongues where stones meet out of sight. A third watches the sunrise and marks the plan with shadows. That division of attention hints at organised work with distinct roles. A mason in the shade at Tiwanaku lifts a plumb bob and lets it still against an edge. The string lines up, the weight barely swings. He closes his eyes as if listening for vibration rather than light. Drops of sweat leave dots on the dust. Across the world, a similar hand could have done the same test in the cool of a Maltese temple passage. That moment shrinks the distance between places. It also undercuts the idea that one grand source fed them all every trick they knew. Factors outside craft nudge designs. Earthquakes drive low centre of gravity walls and wider bases. High plateaus push teams to choose thicker blocks that resist thermal swing. Island limits on timber-force stone shapes that can be pried, rolled, and settled with levers and minimal scaffolding. The environment becomes the silent co-designer. Convergent solutions follow those constraints like water in a channel. Some visitors stare at dovetail cuts at Pumapunku and argue they waited for metal clamps. Others dismiss that and point to wooden keys or stone tenons. The scars alone don't name the material, they only show a mind thinking in connectors. At Baalbek, toolpads left on stone faces may reflect staged lifting, or blocks reserved for later final dressing. A few features are hard to nail down, but uncertainty is honest territory. It keeps the door unlocked for new reads without turning the hall into a carnival of claims. A quick note on numbers without drowning in them. If you map hundreds of temple orientations across a region, patterns emerge toward the cardinal directions or specific azimuth bands where sun and moon key dates live. Some arrangements will hit those by chance. A cluster beyond chance hints at intention. The line between hint and claim is where people stand and argue, quietly or not. We can keep both ideas in mind. Some lines are luck, some are calendar on stone. Down a narrow lane in Malta, an archivist wipes grit from a carved spiral worn by many hands. She says nothing for a minute, just watches dust lift and settle in a thin beam of light. Her small brush moves again. That care repeats the spirit of the builders more than any myth can. They tested, adjusted, and returned. Not once, but over years. That rhythm feels familiar across sites. It doesn't prove a single story. It suggests a shared human pace. A subtle pattern pokes out. Where climate swings hit hard, plans trend toward durable joints and mass that can ride season and quake. When traders cross seas, alignments and ceremonial layouts travel faster than block handling tricks. Where empires want to show reach, stones grow. Where communities need a calendar, orientations fix. The outcome looks like one motif sung in different keys. No single chorus directs it, yet you can hum along. It's tempting to leap to a global map with red threads connecting every megalith and platform. Resist the string. Let skill, need, and environment do most of the pulling. Supporters suggest a drift of memory might ride inside the craft. Tales of flood, sky markers, and a way to seat a stone so it doesn't creep. Critics counter that people don't need a far ancestor to reinvent a lever. Both views can sit at the same table. You can pour tea for both. On the altiplano, the wind rises and falls. It taps the edge of a broken slab and makes a soft note, not quite a whistle. Your fingers are dusty. You take one more slow look across the scatter of blocks and find a groove worn by tools that no longer exist. It's ordinary and strange at the same time, like a footprint that didn't ask to be saved. The thought lands quietly. Progress may not run as a straight line. It may loop, pause, and pick up a thread later with different hands. By the time you step back toward the track, the light has shifted just enough to catch a joint. Then let it go. The pattern is not proof. It is persistent. It returns in weight, edge, and alignment across far edges of the map. Under Orion's belt, you look up and feel the same pull those builders might have felt, and the question turns on us. What do we choose to remember, and what craft are we letting slip into the dark? Perhaps the oldest stones aren't defying physics at all. They feel like muscle memory pressed into rock, a craft that once moved through hands and breath, then slipped out of daily use. You can stand beside a casing fragment or a worn lintel, and sense a method that favoured rhythm, patience, and steady reference to the sky. Not magic, practice. Then time washed across it, and the steps blurred. If tonight's trail felt worth walking, subscribe, share a theory in the comments, and let us know where you're listening from under the same sky. It's always a quiet thrill to see dots on the map glow at midnight. Cairo, Cusco, Reykjavik, Durban. Each of us tracing the same questions while traffic thins outside and the room cools by a few degrees. Your notes often send us down side paths we might have missed, and those paths sometimes loop back to the main road in ways no outline expects. The stars move slowly, the questions wait. Even when tools break, rivers shift and roofs fall in, there is a stubborn memory in worked stone. You touch the face of a block, and it answers with temperature first, then texture, then the faint logic of its edge. Supporters suggest that logic points to a longer arc of know-how than our textbooks allow. Critics counter that simple means scaled with time, can still leave clean lines. Between them, a third thought lingers. Maybe the lesson isn't who, but how attention holds. Maybe the oldest answers are already here, written in rock waiting for steadier light. A dawn survey, a fresh core sample, a night under Orion when the air is clear and the horizon doesn't waver. The next step is small. It is also enough.